The Outbreak, Los Angeles. Before we start the story session, please let us know in the comments what city you're listening in and subscribe if you haven't yet. The support helps to grow the channel. Now let's get to the story. When the first report started flooding in, the sun had barely risen over the Los Angeles skyline. Captain Sarah Mitchell, still sleepy, reached for her vibrating phone on the nightstand. The caller ID displayed restricted, and she knew instantly that her day was about to take a drastic turn. "Captain Mitchell," she answered, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Captain, this is General Hawkins. We have a situation developing in downtown LA. I need you to report to the base immediately. Code Red." Sarah's mind snapped to attention. Code Red only meant a national emergency of the highest order. "Understood, sir. I'm on my way." As she hurriedly dressed in her uniform, Sarah flicked on the TV. The local news was in a frenzy, with reporters struggling to make sense of the chaos unfolding on the streets of Los Angeles. Reports of violent attacks across the city. Witnesses describe assailants as rabid and mindless. The LAPD advises all residents to stay indoors and lock their doors. Sarah's jaw clenched as she watched footage of people running in terror, pursued by figures moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. This was no ordinary riot or terrorist attack. Something was very, very wrong. As she drove to the base, the roads were already clogged with panicked civilians trying to flee the city. Sarah's military training kicked in, allowing her to remain calm amidst the growing hysteria. She knew that whatever was happening, her role would be crucial in the coming hours and days. Upon arrival at the base, Sarah was immediately ushered into a high-security briefing room. The atmosphere was tense, with senior officers huddled around screens displaying live feeds from around the city. At the head of the table stood Lieutenant Colonel Mark Davis, his face a mask of grim determination. "Captain Mitchell, glad you could join us," Davis said, clipped and authoritative. "We're dealing with an unprecedented situation. The CDC has confirmed that we're facing a highly aggressive pathogen, unlike anything they've seen before." Dr. Emily Carter, a CDC virologist, stepped forward. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the military personnel surrounding her. "The virus appears to be transmitted through bodily fluids, primarily saliva," she explained, her tone measured but urgent. "Infected individuals exhibit extreme aggression and a complete loss of higher brain functions. Essentially, we're dealing with what the media already calls a zombie outbreak." A murmur ran through the room. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but maintained her composure. "What are our orders, sir?" she asked, addressing Lieutenant Colonel Davis. Davis's eyes narrowed. "We've just received word from Washington. The President has authorized military action under Title 10. We're forming a joint task force to contain this outbreak by any means necessary." As if on cue, the room's main screen flickered to life, displaying a live feed of the President addressing the nation. His words were grave, outlining the severity of the situation and the measures being taken to protect the American people. "And so, with a heavy heart, I declare a state of emergency in Los Angeles and the surrounding areas. I have authorized our military to take all necessary actions to contain this threat and protect our citizens. May God be with us all in this dark hour." As the President's address concluded, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Officers began issuing orders and coordinating with other branches of the military and government agencies. Sarah was assigned to lead a tactical response team, securing critical infrastructure and establishing safe zones within the city. "Captain Mitchell," Lieutenant Colonel Davis called out as she was about to leave the room, "I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. We're not just fighting to save Los Angeles, we're fighting to save humanity. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, this infection must not spread beyond the city limits. Is that clear?" Sarah met his gaze, recognizing the weight of responsibility in his eyes. "Crystal clear, sir." As she left the briefing room, Sarah nearly collided with a young soldier rushing down the hallway. She recognized him as Private Jake Thompson, a recent addition to her unit. "Captain Mitchell," Thompson exclaimed, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Is it true? Are we really facing zombies?" Sarah studied the young man's face, noting the eagerness that barely masked his underlying terror. She remembered reading his file, a troubled past, joining the military for purpose and redemption. Now, he was about to face a threat none had ever trained for. "Private," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "I need you to focus. Whatever we're facing, our job remains the same: protect civilians and follow orders. Can you do that?" Thompson straightened his posture, clearly trying to project confidence. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." "Good. Gear up and report to Transport Bay 3 in 15 minutes. We're moving out." As Thompson hurried off, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection. The weight of command had never felt heavier. She thought of the civilians in Los Angeles, unaware of the full extent of their danger. She thought of her team, young men and women who had signed up to serve their country, but now faced an enemy beyond their wildest nightmares. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Sarah led her team into the heart of Los Angeles, coordinating with local law enforcement to establish safe zones and evacuation routes. The scenes they encountered were like something out of a horror movie. Streets littered with abandoned vehicles, the air filled with screams, and the occasional burst of gunfire. As night fell, the city descended into chaos. The infected grew more numerous and aggressive, overwhelming police barricades and forcing the military to take more drastic measures. Sarah found herself making split-second decisions that she knew would haunt her for years to come. Ordering her team to open fire on civilians who showed signs of infection and sealing off entire neighborhoods to contain the spread. Sarah watched from her command post atop a hastily fortified skyscraper as fires began to spread across the city. Once a symbol of glamour and aspiration, the Los Angeles skyline now looked like a vision of hell on earth. Her radio crackled to life. "Captain Mitchell, this is command. We're implementing Operation Lockdown. I repeat, Operation Lockdown is now in effect. Seal all access points to the city. No one gets in or out without direct authorization from HQ." Sarah closed her eyes momentarily, steeling herself for what was to come. "Understood, command. Initiating Operation Lockdown." As she relayed the orders to her team, Sarah caught sight of Private Thompson. The young soldier's face was smeared with dirt and what looked unsettlingly like blood, his earlier bravado replaced by a 1,000-yard stare. "Thompson," she called out, her voice softer than usual. "You holding up okay?" He turned to her, his eyes focusing with visible effort. I think so, Captain. It's just, I never imagined anything like this. How do we fight something that used to be human?" Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, aware of the eyes of the rest of her team upon them. "We remember our training, follow our orders, and never forget why we're here, to protect those who can't protect themselves. That's how we fight, Private." As if to punctuate her words, a series of explosions rocked the city, the military demolishing key bridges and tunnels to isolate the infection. Sarah turned to the window, watching as a wall of smoke and fire rose to encircle Los Angeles. Operation Lockdown was now in full effect. The city was quarantined, cut off from the outside world. Sarah Mitchell and her team stood as the thin line between civilization and the nightmare that threatened to consume it. As dawn broke on the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the ravaged city, Sarah allowed herself a moment of grim reflection. This was only the beginning. The real test of their training, their humanity, and their very survival was yet to come. "Captain Mitchell," a voice called out, breaking her from her thoughts. She turned to see Lieutenant Colonel Mark Davis approaching, his face a mask of grim determination. "We need to establish the perimeter immediately. Every second counts." Sarah nodded, her training kicking in despite the surreal nature of their situation. "Understood, sir. I'll coordinate with the ground teams to set up the checkpoints." As Sarah began issuing orders through her comm unit, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The city she had sworn to protect was now a battleground against an enemy they barely understood. The infected, or zombies as some of the younger soldiers had taken to calling them, were unlike anything they had ever faced before. Within hours, the military's presence in Los Angeles had transformed the city. Heavily armed soldiers patrolled the streets, their faces obscured by gas masks and protective gear. Checkpoints sprang up at major intersections, creating a web of control points that would form the basis of the quarantine zone. Private Jake Thompson stood at attention at one such checkpoint, his rifle held tightly against his chest. Despite his best efforts to appear calm and collected, His eyes darted nervously from person to person as a line of civilians approached. Sergeant Lisa Nguyen reminded him, her voice steady and reassuring. Remember, check for any signs of infection. If you're unsure, call for a medical team. We can't take any chances. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, Sergeant, he replied, his voice cracking slightly. As he began screening the civilians, he couldn't shake the memory of his past failures. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. Meanwhile, Emily Carter found herself in a heated discussion with Colonel James Reed at a hastily established command center across the city. We need to prioritize the evacuation of vulnerable populations, Emily insisted, her frustration evident in her clipped tone. The elderly, the immunocompromised are at the highest risk. Colonel Reed nodded, his expression thoughtful. I understand your concern, Doctor, but we have to balance that with maintaining order and preventing further spread of the infection. Emily opened her mouth to argue further, but was interrupted by Captain Mitchell's arrival. Sarah's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but her voice remained steady as she addressed them. We've established the initial perimeter, she reported, but we're facing resistance in some areas. People are scared and don't understand why we're locking down the city. Colonel Reed's brow furrowed. We need a communication strategy. The last thing we want is mass panic. As if on cue, the command center's screens lit up with news broadcasts from around the city. Reporters, their voices tinged with barely concealed fear, relayed conflicting information about the outbreak and the military's response. Sarah watched the screens, her heart sinking. Sir, I'd like to coordinate with our public affairs team with your permission. We need to get accurate information to the public as quickly as possible. Colonel Reed nodded his approval, and Sarah set to work. Over the next few hours, she crafted a series of public service announcements that would be broadcast across all available channels. The messages were clear and concise, explaining the quarantine's nature and the steps to protect the civilian population. As night fell over Los Angeles, the true scope of the quarantine zone became apparent. The city glowed with an unnatural light, combining emergency floodlights and the eerie green of night vision goggles. From her vantage point atop a makeshift watchtower, Sarah could see the entire perimeter, a steel and concrete ring separating the infected from the rest of the world. Her radio crackled to life. Captain Mitchell, this is Checkpoint Charlie. We've got a situation here. Sarah's hand flew to her earpiece. Go ahead, Checkpoint Charlie. We've got a group of civilians trying to break through the perimeter. They're saying they have family outside the zone. It's getting heated, ma'am. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself. I'm on my way. Do not, I repeat, do not use lethal force unless absolutely necessary. As she made her way to the checkpoint, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their problems. The quarantine zone may have been established, but the real challenge lay in maintaining it and dealing with the human cost of their actions. At Checkpoint Charlie, Sarah found a tense standoff between a group of desperate civilians and a line of nervous soldiers. Private Thompson was among them, his rifle raised but his hands visibly shaking. Please, a woman at the front of the group pleaded, her eyes wild with fear and desperation. My daughter is out there. She needs me. Sarah stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but need you to listen. The quarantine is for everyone's safety, including your daughter's. We have teams working to reunite families, but the most important thing is maintaining the perimeter right now. The woman's face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to let emotions cloud her judgment, not when so much was at stake. As she worked to defuse the situation, Sarah couldn't help but notice the fear and confusion etched on the faces of both the civilians and her own soldiers. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, a constant reminder of the lives that hung in the balance. Back at the command center, Dr. Carter pored over the latest data on the outbreak, her brow furrowed in concentration. Lieutenant Colonel Davis approached, his face a mask of concern. Any progress on understanding this thing? He asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head, frustration evident in her tone. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. The rate of mutation is off the charts. We're working around the clock, but... She trailed off, the unspoken implications hanging heavy in the air. Davis nodded grimly. Keep at it, Doctor. We're counting on you. As the night wore on, the true horror of their situation began to sink in. Reports flooded in from all corners of the quarantine zone, infected individuals breaking into homes, families torn apart by the virus, and the ever-present fear of what the next day might bring. Sarah was back at the command center, her uniform stained with sweat and grime. She looked around at the faces of her fellow officers, seeing her own exhaustion and uncertainty reflected back at her. We've established the quarantine zone, she said, her voice hoarse from hours of giving orders. But this is just the beginning. We need to be prepared for what comes next. Colonel Reed nodded solemnly. Agreed. We'll need to implement strict protocols for movement within the zone, set up safe houses for uninfected civilians, and establish clear rules of engagement for dealing with the infected. As the meeting continued, Sarah's mind wandered to the faces she had seen throughout the day. The terrified civilians, the determined soldiers, and the haunted looks of those who had come face to face with the infected. She knew that their decisions in the coming days and weeks would determine not just the fate of Los Angeles, but potentially the entire world. Outside the command center, the city of Los Angeles lay silent, a stark contrast to its usual vibrant energy. The quarantine zone stood as a testament to humanity's determination to survive, and a grim reminder of the fragility of civilization. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Captain Sarah Mitchell steeled herself for the challenges ahead, knowing that the actual test of their resolve was only just beginning. Sarah's radio buzzed. Captain Mitchell, this is Sergeant Nguyen. We've got a situation at Grid Charlie 9. Over. Go ahead, Sergeant, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her gut. Ma'am, we've identified a group of civilians trapped in the Skyline Tower. It's a high-rise in the financial district. They're surrounded by infected, and the building's integrity is compromised. We need to decide how to proceed. Over. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was precisely the kind of scenario they'd been dreading. How many civilians? We estimate between 50 and 75, ma'am. Mostly office workers who couldn't evacuate in time. Understood. Hold your position and maintain surveillance. I'm calling an emergency meeting. Mitchell out. Sarah was in a heated debate with the task force's leadership within the hour. The makeshift war room buzzed with tension as voices rose and fell, each argument more impassioned than the last. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Davis paced the length of the room, his face a mask of grim determination. We can't risk it, Captain. Those civilians are as good as dead, and attempting a rescue could compromise the entire containment operation. Dr. Emily Carter, her lab coat wrinkled from days without rest, shot back. We can't just abandon them. They're human beings, not acceptable losses. With all due respect, Doctor, Davis countered, his voice sharp. This isn't your field of expertise. We're dealing with a potential extinction-level event. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Sarah felt the weight of all eyes in the room upon her. She knew her following words would shape the course of their mission and potentially the fate of humanity. What are our options? She asked, her tone measured. Colonel James Reed stepped forward with his salt and pepper hair, which was a testament to years of service. We have two primary courses of action, he began, his voice carrying the gravitas of experience. Option 1, we initiate a controlled demolition of the building. It would eliminate the threat of the infected inside and prevent any potential spread. A murmur rippled through the room, and Sarah saw Dr. Carter's face pale at the suggestion. Reed continued, Option 2, we mount a rescue operation. It's high risk, with potential for significant casualties on both sides, but it's the only way to save those civilians. Private Jake Thompson, standing at attention near the door, couldn't hide the look of horror on his young face at the mention of demolition. Sarah mentally noted his reaction, recognizing the human element that was so easy to lose sight of in the fog of crisis. What about the building's structural integrity? Sarah asked, turning to the engineering specialist. It's compromised, ma'am, the specialist replied. The lower floors have taken significant damage from the infected. We estimate it could hold for another 48 to 72 hours before critical failure. Sarah nodded, her mind racing through scenarios. And the infected? What's their concentration like? Sergeant Nguyen stepped forward, pulling up a holographic display of the building. Heavy concentration on the ground floor and up to the 10th. The civilians are holed up from the 20th floor and above. We're looking at hundreds of infected between us and them. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Sarah could feel the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. Each life in that building a silent cry for help. "We can't just kill them," Dr. Carter pleaded, breaking the silence. "These people trusted us to protect them. If we demolish that building, we're no better than the infected." Lieutenant Colonel Davis slammed his fist on the table. "And if we risk our men and women on a suicide mission, we're betraying every oath we took to defend this nation. Sometimes hard decisions must be made for the greater good." Sarah raised her hand, silencing the room. "I understand both perspectives," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "But we need to consider all angles. From a medical standpoint, Dr. Carter, is there any chance these civilians are infected?" Carter shook her head. "Given the incubation period and the time they've been isolated, it's doubtful. If they were infected, they would have turned by now." Sarah nodded, then turned to Davis. "Colonel, what would be our best approach if we were to attempt a rescue?" Davis frowned but answered professionally. "A small elite team, fast roping from helicopters to the roof, clear from the top down, extract the civilians and exfil via air. But Captain, the risks are substantial, I know." Sarah finished for him. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her following words. "But so is the cost of inaction. We're not just fighting to contain a virus, we're fighting to preserve our humanity. If we start sacrificing innocent lives for expedience, we've already lost." She turned to address the entire room. "I'm authorizing a rescue operation. We'll assemble a volunteer team, top-of-the-line equipment, and full hazmat protocols. Our primary objective is civilian extraction, but we'll also gather any intel on the infected's behavior in confined spaces." The room erupted in a mix of relieved sighs and concerned murmurs. Sarah raised her voice to be heard over the din. "I know the risks, I know the odds, but this is what separates us from the infected. We don't abandon our own." As the meeting adjourned and plans began to take shape, Sarah felt a presence at her side. It was Private Thompson, his eyes shining with admiration and fear. "Captain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'd like to volunteer for the rescue team." Sarah studied him momentarily, seeing both the eagerness of youth and the shadows of his past traumas. "Are you sure, Private? This isn't going to be a walk in the park." Thompson nodded firmly. "I joined to make a difference, ma'am. This is our chance to show that every life matters." A small smile tugged at Sarah's lips. "All right, Thompson. Report to Sergeant Nguyen for briefing. And Private, remember, bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, despite the fear." As Thompson saluted and hurried off, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Colonel Reed, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "That was a hell of a call, Captain," he said softly. "I hope it's the right one." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where the silhouette of the Skyline Tower loomed in the distance. "So do I, sir. So do I." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the quarantine zone into shadows, Sarah knew that the coming hours would test their military prowess and the core of their humanity. The decision had been made. Now they had to live with the consequences. The sun had barely risen over the quarantined Los Angeles skyline when Captain Sarah Mitchell strode into the command center, her face etched with determination. The air was thick with tension, palpable electricity that seemed to crackle between the officers gathered around the central table. At the head stood Lieutenant Colonel Mark Davis, his steely gaze fixed on the holographic display of the city before them. "Captain Mitchell, glad you could join us," Davis said, clipped and professional. "We were just discussing our next move regarding the civilians in the Wilshire Grand Center." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the faces of her fellow officers. She could sense the unease, the weight of the decision they were about to make hanging heavy in the air. "What's the current situation, sir?" Colonel James Reed, standing to Davis's right, cleared his throat. "We've confirmed approximately 200 civilians trapped on the upper floors. The building is surrounded by infected, and we're picking up distress signals from inside. 200 souls, Sarah murmured, her mind racing with the implications. She looked up, meeting Davis's eyes. Sir, we need to mount a rescue operation. We can't just leave them there to die. Davis's jaw tightened. Captain, I understand your concern, but we must consider the bigger picture. That building is a ticking time bomb. If even one of those civilians is infected, we risk unleashing hell on the rest of the quarantine zone. The room fell silent, the weight of Davis's words settling over them like a shroud. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of frustration and determination coursing through her veins. She opened her mouth to respond, but Colonel Reed beat her. With all due respect, Lieutenant Colonel, Reed said, calm but firm, we are responsible for protecting civilian life. These people are counting on us. Davis turned to Reed, his eyes narrowing. And what about the millions of lives outside this zone? Are we willing to risk their safety for 200? The ensuing debate was heated, voices rising and falling as officers argued their positions. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, her tactical mind wrestling with her sense of moral duty. She couldn't shake the image of those trapped civilians, terrified and alone, waiting for a rescue that might never come. As the argument reached a fever pitch, Dr. Emily Carter burst into the room, her lab coat billowing behind her. I have new information, she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. We've isolated a key component of the virus. It's possible we could use this to develop a more effective screening process. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the virologist. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope spark within her. Dr. Carter, what exactly are you saying? Emily's eyes met Sarah's, a hint of excitement breaking through her professional demeanor. I'm saying we might be able to identify infected individuals more accurately. It's not foolproof, but it could significantly reduce the risk of bringing infected civilians into the safe zone. Lieutenant Colonel Davis frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. That's all good, Doctor, but how quickly can you implement this screening process? With the right resources, we could have a prototype ready within 24 hours, Emily replied, her confidence unwavering. The room erupted into murmurs, officers exchanging glances and hushed words. Sarah saw an opportunity and seized it. Sir, she said, addressing Davis, this could be our solution. We mount a rescue operation, extract the civilians, and subject them to Dr. Carter's enhanced screening before allowing them into the safe zone. Davis's expression remained impassive, but Sarah could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He turned to Colonel Reed. Your thoughts, James? Reed nodded slowly. It's risky, but it's our best option. We can't abandon those people in good conscience, not when we can save them. For a moment, the room held its breath, all eyes on Lieutenant Colonel Davis. Sarah felt her heart pounding, silently willing him to make the right choice. Finally, Davis spoke. All right, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of command. We'll proceed with the rescue operation. But, he added, his gaze sweeping the room, I want every precaution taken. We're not just risking the lives of those civilians, but the lives of every soldier we send in there. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, but Sarah knew the real challenge was just beginning. As the officers dispersed to begin preparations, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Private Jake Thompson, his young face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Captain, he said, his voice low, I want to volunteer for the rescue team. Sarah studied him for a moment, remembering his eagerness and the trauma that lurked behind his eyes. Are you sure about this, Thompson? It's going to be dangerous in there. Jake nodded, his jaw set with determination. I need to do this, ma'am. I need to prove that I can make a difference. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. All right, Thompson. Report to Sergeant Gwine for briefing. And Jake, she added, her voice softening slightly, be careful in there. As Jake hurried off, Sarah turned to find Dr. Carter approaching. The virologist's face was a mask of professional concern. Captain Mitchell, a word. They stepped aside, finding a quiet corner amidst the bustle of preparation. Emily's voice was low and urgent. Sarah, I need you to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. This virus, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. The screening process I mentioned, it's our best shot, but it's not infallible. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying, Emily? I'm saying that even with our best efforts, there's a chance we could miss something. And if we do, Emily trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. Sarah nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. I understand. We'll take every precaution and run every test. But we have to try, Emily. We can't just leave them to die. As they parted ways, Sarah was alone momentarily, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. The city she had sworn to protect now looked alien, a wasteland of abandoned streets and distant screams. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to center herself. When she opened them again, her resolve was iron. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever horrors they might face in that tower of glass and steel, she would face them. For the civilians trapped inside, for her team, and for the oath she had sworn to protect and serve. As she turned back to the command center, Sarah caught sight of Lieutenant Colonel Davis watching her. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, concern, she couldn't be sure. "Captain Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "A word in private, if you please." Sarah followed him into a small office adjacent to the command center. As the door closed behind them, Davis's rigid posture softened slightly. "Sarah," he said, his use of her first name catching her off guard, "I need you to understand something. This rescue operation, it's more than just a tactical decision. It's a statement about who we are, what we stand for as a military force." Sarah nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "I understand, sir." Davis's eyes met hers, and momentarily she saw the toll this crisis was taking on him. "If this goes wrong, it won't just be those civilians at risk if we fail. It could undermine everything we're trying to achieve here. The trust of the public and the integrity of our containment efforts could all come crashing down." "Then we won't fail," Sarah said, her voice firm with conviction. "We'll do whatever it takes to get those people out safely and maintain the security of the quarantine zone." A ghost of a smile flickered across Davis's face. "That's what I'm counting on, Captain. I'm entrusting you with this operation because, despite our differences, I know you'll do what needs to be done, whatever the cost." As Sarah left the office, her mind raced with plans and contingencies. She knew the enormity of the task ahead, the lives that hung in the balance. But as she looked around at her team, at Jake's youthful determination, Emily's unwavering focus, and the seasoned professionalism of soldiers like Sergeant Nguyen, she felt a surge of hope. They were more than just a military unit. They were humanity's last line of defense against the nightmare that had engulfed Los Angeles, and come hell or high water, they would not fail. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the desolate city, Sarah Mitchell steeled herself for the battle ahead. The rescue operation would begin at dawn, with it the true test of their resolve, skill, and humanity. In the face of unimaginable horror, they would stand strong. They would fight not just for survival, but for the soul of what it meant to be human in a world gone mad. As Sarah looked out over the city one last time before plunging into the final preparations, she made a silent vow. Whatever happened in that tower, whatever horrors they might face, she would not let the light of compassion be extinguished. In this darkest of hours, they would be the beacon of hope that Los Angeles, and perhaps the world, so desperately needed. The pre-dawn sky cast an eerie glow over Los Angeles as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the base of the Skyline Tower, her eyes scanning the looming structure. The once gleaming skyscraper now stood as a monument to the chaos that engulfed the city. Broken windows and makeshift barricades dotted its facade, silent testaments to the desperate struggle for survival within. Sarah turned to face her team, a mix of seasoned soldiers and volunteers. Among them stood Private Jake Thompson, his young face a mask of determination tinged with fear. Dr. Emily Carter stood nearby, medical kit at the ready, her presence a reminder of the dual nature of their mission, to rescue and to heal. "Listen up," Sarah's voice cut through the tense silence. "We're facing an unprecedented situation. Our priority is to extract the civilians trapped on the upper floors. But make no mistake, this building is crawling and infected. Use non-lethal force whenever possible, but do not hesitate to protect yourselves and the civilians. Are we clear?" A chorus of affirmatives echoed back. Sarah nodded, her gaze lingering on Jake. Thompson, you're with me. Dr. Carter, you'll coordinate with the medical team at the base. Let's move out. As they entered the lobby, the stench of decay assaulted their senses. Overturned furniture and shattered glass crunched beneath their boots. Sarah raised her fist, signaling the team to halt as a low moan echoed from the shadows. "Contact, 2 o'clock," Jake whispered, his rifle trained on a lurching figure emerging from behind a reception desk. Sarah's mind raced, weighing the need for stealth against the potential threat. "Non-lethal," she ordered, reaching for her stun baton. The infected lunged, its movements jerky and unpredictable. Sarah sidestepped, bringing the baton down in a swift arc. The creature crumpled, twitching on the floor. "Secure it," she commanded, and 2 soldiers moved to restrain the infected individual. As they progressed through the building, the signs of desperate survival became more evident. Hastily constructed barricades blocked corridors, and messages scrawled in various substances, some Sarah preferred not to identify, covered the walls. "My God," Jake muttered as they passed a particularly harrowing scene. "How long have these people been trapped here?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Too long, but we're here now. Stay focused." They encountered sporadic resistance from the infected, and each encountered a test of their resolve to minimize casualties. Sarah watched as Jake's movements became more assured, his initial hesitation giving way to a grim efficiency. As they reached the mid-levels of the tower, the sound of gunfire erupted from above. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Captain Mitchell, this is Team Bravo. We've encountered heavy resistance on the 30th floor. Civilians reported 1 level up. Request backup, over." "Copy that, Bravo. Hold your position." "We're on our way," Sarah responded, gesturing for her team to pick up the pace. The stairwell echoed with their rapid footsteps as they ascended. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the now familiar stench of the infected. As they burst onto the 30th floor, chaos reigned. Team Bravo was pinned down behind a makeshift barricade, a swarm of infected pressing in from all sides. Sarah's team moved with practiced precision, creating a crossfire that drove back the horde. "Thompson, with me!" Sarah shouted, spotting a gap in the infected's ranks. They sprinted towards the stairwell leading to the 31st floor, the screams of trapped civilians growing louder. The scene that greeted them as they reached the next level was one of desperation. A group of survivors, haggard and terrified, had barricaded themselves in a large conference room. The glass walls were cracked but holding, a mass of infected clawing at the barriers. "We need to clear a path," Sarah said, her mind racing through tactical options. "Thompson, take half the team and set up a defensive perimeter. I'll lead the extraction." As Jake moved to follow her orders, Sarah approached the conference room. "This is Captain Sarah Mitchell of the U.S. Army. We're here to evacuate you. Stay calm and follow our instructions." The relief on the faces of the survivors was palpable, but Sarah knew the most challenging part was yet to come. As they began to dismantle the barricade, the infected outside grew more frenzied, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the floor. "Captain, we've got incoming!" Jake's voice rang out as a fresh wave of infection poured from the elevators. Sarah made a split-second decision. "Thompson, hold the line. Everyone else, get these people out now." What followed was a blur of action. Sarah found herself at the heart of the chaos, alternating between guiding terrified civilians and fending off the relentless infected. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, screams, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. In the midst of the fray, Sarah spotted an elderly woman stumbling, about to be overwhelmed. Without hesitation, she threw herself into the path of an oncoming infected, her stun baton connecting with a sickening crack. "Go!" she shouted to the woman, who was quickly ushered away by another soldier. As they neared the stairwell, Sarah realized with growing dread that their exit was being cut off. The infected were pouring in from above and below, their numbers seemingly endless. "Mitchell, to all units, our primary exit is compromised. Initiating Plan Bravo." I repeat, initiating Plan Bravo. Plan Bravo was risky, using explosives to create an alternative exit route through the building's exterior. It was a last resort that could potentially destabilize the entire structure. But as Sarah looked at the faces of the survivors, at Jake and her team fighting with everything they had, she knew it was their only choice. "Thompson," she called out, "get those charges set. We're blowing our way out of here. Jake nodded, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He moved purposefully, placing the explosives with a precision that belied his youth. Fire in the hole! The warning came seconds before the world erupted in a cacophony of sound and fury. The blast tore a ragged hole in the building's side, the sudden rush of fresh air starkly contrasting the stifling atmosphere inside. Move, move, move! Sarah's voice cut through the ringing in their ears. She ushered the survivors towards the opening, where helicopters were already hovering, ready for extraction. As the last civilians were loaded onto the choppers, Sarah turned to survey the scene. The floor was littered with bodies, both infected and military. The cost had been high, but they had succeeded. "Captain, we need to go," Jake shouted over the helicopter's roar. "The building's integrity is compromised." Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the devastation around her. As she climbed aboard the chopper, the weight of the day's events settled heavily on her shoulders. They had saved lives, yes, but at what cost? And what would tomorrow bring in this city teetering on the brink of oblivion? As the helicopters pulled away from the skyline tower, Sarah watched the structure begin to crumble, a visual metaphor for the fragile state of their world. The rescue operation had been a success, but it was clear that this was only the beginning of a long and arduous battle, not just against the infected, but against the limits of human resilience and compassion in the face of unimaginable horror. As she descended to ground level, the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. The rescue had been successful, but at what cost? The faces of her team, exhausted and haunted, told a story of their own. "Captain," Lieutenant Colonel Mark Davis approached, his voice gruff with fatigue. "We need to talk about the fallout from last night." Sarah nodded, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. They walked together towards the briefing room, passing soldiers and civilians alike. The air was thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Dr. Emily Carter was waiting inside, her usually pristine lab coat wrinkled and stained. "The media's having a field day," she said without preamble, gesturing to a nearby screen displaying various news channels. The headlines scrolled by, each more damning than the last. Military mayhem, rescue or reckless endangerment. Civilian casualties mount in botched operation. Who's really in control, the infected or the military? Sarah felt a surge of anger. "We saved lives last night. How can they twist it like this?" "Perception is everything in a crisis," Davis replied, his tone measured. "And right now, the perception is that we're losing control." "We need to get ahead of this," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Dr. Carter, what's the status of the civilians we rescued?" Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "We've screened them all for infection. So far, no signs of the virus, but we're keeping them under observation. The problem is, they're talking to the press, and their stories aren't exactly painting us in the best light." Sarah frowned. "What are they saying? That we were too aggressive, that we caused unnecessary damage to the building, that we didn't do enough to protect them from the infection during the extraction," Emily said. "Some even claim we used them as bait to draw out the infected." "That's ridiculous," Sarah snapped, then caught herself. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "We need to counter these narratives, get our side of the story out there." Davis nodded in agreement. "I've already requested a press conference. We need to present a united front, emphasize the operation's success, and address the concerns head-on." As they prepared for the press conference, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew that every word and every gesture would be scrutinized. The trust between the military and the civilians they were meant to protect hung by a thread. Hours later, Sarah stood before a sea of cameras and microphones, the glare of the lights almost blinding. She spoke with carefully measured words, emphasizing the situation's complexity and the difficult decisions they had faced. "Last night, we undertook a high-risk operation to rescue over 200 civilians trapped in a compromised structure," she began. "We faced the threat of the infected and the dangers of a collapsing building. Every decision we made was with the sole purpose of saving as many lives as possible." As she continued, addressing the allegations and explaining their tactics, she could see the skepticism in the reporters' eyes. They fired question after question, each more pointed than the last. "Captain Mitchell, reports suggest that your team used excessive force. How do you respond to allegations of unnecessary civilian casualties? Sarah felt a flicker of anger but kept her composure. We used the minimum force necessary to ensure the safety of civilians and our team. In a situation where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death, our priority was to neutralize threats swiftly and efficiently. The questions continued, relentless and probing. By the time the press conference ended, Sarah felt drained, unsure if she had made any headway in swaying public opinion. Back at the command center, the team gathered for an after-action review. The mood was somber as they dissected every aspect of the operation, from the initial planning to the final extraction. Still visibly shaken from the night's events, Private Jake Thompson spoke up. "Ma'am, I can't help but wonder, did we do the right thing? The way those civilians looked at us when we got them out, it was like they were more afraid of us than the infected." Sarah met his gaze, seeing the conflict in his eyes. "Jake, there are rarely clear-cut right or wrong answers in situations like these. We did what we believed was necessary to save lives, but that doesn't mean we can't learn and improve." Dr. Carter chimed in, her voice tired but determined. "We need to focus on rebuilding trust. The civilians must see us as protectors, not just another threat." "Agreed," Davis said, surprising Sarah with his support. "We need to adjust our approach, find a balance between military efficiency and humanitarian concerns." As the meeting progressed, they outlined new strategies for future operations. Enhanced communication protocols to keep civilians informed, non-lethal containment methods for the infected, and increased collaboration with local leaders and first responders. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope as she saw her team coming together, adapting and evolving in the face of adversity. But as the day wore on, reports from the quarantine zone painted a grim picture. Civilian unrest was growing. Protests had broken out at several checkpoints, with people demanding to be let out or to have loved ones let in. The infected, drawn by the noise and commotion, gathered more significantly along the perimeter. As night fell, Sarah stood again atop the command center, watching the city below. Fires burned in scattered locations, and the distant sound of gunfire echoed through the streets. The threat of the infection still loomed large, a constant reminder of the precarious balance they were trying to maintain. She thought back to the civilians they had rescued, to the fear and mistrust in their eyes. How could they bridge that gap? How could they fulfill their duty to protect while maintaining their humanity? A soft footstep behind her announced Dr. Carter's presence. "Penny, for your thoughts, Captain?" Sarah turned, offering a weary smile. "Just wondering where we go from here. How do we move forward when every decision we make is questioned, when the people we're trying to save see us as the enemy?" Emily stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the chaotic cityscape. "We keep trying. We learn, adapt, and never forget why we're here. To save lives, protect the innocent, and find a way through this nightmare." Sarah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right. We can't give up. Too much is at stake." As they stood there, watching over the city they had sworn to protect, Sarah knew the challenges ahead would be immense. The fallout from their actions would continue to ripple through the quarantine zone, shaping the days and weeks to come. But in that moment, she made a silent vow. They would find a way to balance the harsh realities of their situation with the compassion and humanity that set them apart from the horrors they faced. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. They had to try for the sake of the city, for the civilians trapped within, and for their own souls. The night stretched on, full of uncertainty and danger. But as Sarah prepared to face another day in this new, terrifying world, she held on to a sliver of hope. They would adapt, they would overcome, and somehow they would find a way to save not just lives, but the essence of what made them human. Story number 2, the Moscow outbreak. The flickering glow of television screens illuminated anxious faces across Moscow as an emergency news broadcast cut through the usual evening programming. The anchor's voice, usually calm and collected, now carried a tremor of urgency that sent chills down the viewers' spines. "We interrupt our regular broadcast to bring you breaking news. Reports are coming in of a strange illness spreading rapidly through Moscow, causing violent outbreaks among civilians. Authorities are urging residents to remain calm and stay indoors." Commander Alexei Petrov stood rigidly in the dimly lit situation room, his weathered face a mask of concentration as he absorbed the dire information scrolling across multiple screens. The room buzzed nervously as officers and analysts scrambled to make sense of the incoming data. "Sir, we're receiving reports of multiple incidents across the city." A young lieutenant reported, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Hospitals are being overwhelmed with patients exhibiting extreme aggression and unusual physical symptoms." Petrov's steely gaze swept across the room, taking in the grim faces of his fellow officers. He had seen his share of crises during his distinguished military career, but this was something entirely different. "What's the current assessment?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Petrov's right-hand man, Major Igor Sokolov, stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Initial reports suggest some kind of highly contagious pathogen, sir. Those infected are displaying monstrous behavior, attacking others indiscriminately, seemingly impervious to pain or reason." A chill ran down Petrov's spine as the implications sank in. This was no ordinary outbreak. The word no one dared speak aloud hung in the air: zombies. "Sir," Sokolov continued, his voice tight with tension, "we've just received word. The government has activated military emergency protocols. We're being mobilized to respond." Petrov nodded grimly. "Very well. Let's get to work, people. We need to establish command centers across the city immediately. I want special forces units deployed for reconnaissance. We need to assess the scale of this outbreak and contain it before it spreads further." As the room erupted into a flurry of activity, Petrov felt the weight of responsibility settles heavily on his shoulders. He had sworn an oath to protect his country, but never in his wildest nightmares had he imagined facing a threat like this. Outside, the streets of Moscow were descending into chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance as emergency vehicles raced through the city. Panicked civilians flooded the streets, some desperately trying to flee, others seeking shelter or supplies. The infected moved among them, their numbers growing with each passing minute. Lieutenant Anna Volkova, young and idealistic, found herself thrust into the heart of the crisis. As she led her unit through the increasingly treacherous streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world as she knew it was crumbling around her. "Keep formation," she barked at her soldiers, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "Remember your training. We're here to protect civilians and maintain order." But as they rounded a corner, the true horror of the situation became apparent. A group of infected individuals was tearing into a screaming woman, their movements jerky and inhuman. Without hesitation, Volkova raised her weapon. "Open fire!" she commanded, her voice cracking slightly. The staccato of gunfire filled the air and the infected fell, but the damage was done. The woman lay motionless on the blood-stained pavement. Volkova swallowed hard, fighting back the bile rising in her throat. This was not the noble military service she had envisioned when she joined. As she radioed in their position in the encounter, she couldn't help but wonder how many more innocent lives would be lost before this nightmare was over. Commander Petrov pored over maps and reports at the hastily established command center, trying to piece together a coherent picture of the unfolding catastrophe. The city he had sworn to protect was rapidly becoming a war zone, with pockets of infection spreading like wildfire. "We need to establish a perimeter," he declared, finger tracing a line on the map. "Set up checkpoints here, here, and we must contain the spread and create safe zones for uninfected civilians." As his officers rushed to carry out his orders, Petrov allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Every decision he made could mean life and death for countless individuals. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the window, he could see a group of terrified civilians being ushered into the building by soldiers. Among them was a woman with determination etched on her face, despite the fear in her eyes. She appeared to be tending to the wounded, her movements efficient and practiced. "Who is that?" Petrov asked, gesturing towards the woman. Sokolov consulted his tablet. "That's Dr. Elena Mikhailova, sir. She was working at a nearby hospital when the outbreak hit. She managed to lead a group of survivors to safety." Petrov nodded, impressed by the doctor's resourcefulness. In such times, civilians with such courage and capability could prove invaluable. As night fell over Moscow, the city transformed into a nightmarish landscape of flickering fires, abandoned vehicles, and the ever-present moans of the infected. Special forces teams, moving swiftly through the shadows, reported with increasingly grim news. "The infection is spreading faster than we anticipated, sir," a gruff sergeant reported via radio. "We've encountered large groups of infected individuals in residential areas. They seem to be drawn to noise and movement." Petrov absorbed the information, his mind racing to formulate strategies. "Focus on extracting any survivors you encounter," he ordered. "But be cautious. We can't afford to lose any more personnel." As the hours ticked by, the accurate scale of the catastrophe became apparent. The infected were not just isolated incidents, but a rapidly growing horde that threatened to overwhelm the city's defenses. The military fought a war on two fronts, against the infected and against the rising tide of panic among the uninfected populace. In the early morning, Petrov received a transmission that sent a chill down his spine. The infection had spread beyond Moscow's city limits. What had started as a localized outbreak was now threatening to become a national crisis. "We need to inform the highest levels of government," Petrov told Sokolov, his voice grave. "This is beyond our capacity to contain. We may need to consider more drastic measures." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. Both men knew that drastic measures could mean sacrificing parts of the city to save the whole. As dawn broke over a changed Moscow, Commander Alexei Petrov stood at the command center's window, watching as columns of smoke rose from various parts of the city. The weight of command pressed down on him like a physical force. He had faced many challenges in his military career, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The city he had sworn to protect was teetering on the brink of collapse. The infected roamed the streets in growing numbers, while terrified civilians huddled in makeshift shelters or desperately sought escape. And caught in the middle were his soldiers, brave men and women fighting against an enemy they could barely comprehend. Petrov's mind raced with the decisions that lay ahead. How far would he go to contain this outbreak? What sacrifices would he be willing to make? And could he live with the consequences of those choices? As he turned back to the bustling command center, Petrov steeled himself for the battles to come. He would face whatever happened head-on, guided by his duty to protect and his moral compass. The invasion had begun, and the fate of Moscow, perhaps even Russia itself, hung in the balance. The early morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick haze that had settled over Moscow, casting an eerie, muted light across the city. Commander Alexei Petrov stood atop a makeshift command post, his eyes scanning the horizon. The once bustling metropolis now lay silent, save for the occasional distant scream or the ominous rumble of military vehicles. "Status report, Major Sokolov," Petrov commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Major Igor Sokolov approached, his uniform pristine despite the long duty hours. "Sir, we've established checkpoints at all major intersections leading into the infected zones. Heavy artillery units are positioned along the perimeter, and armored divisions are standing by for deployment." Petrov nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And the civilian evacuation?" "Ongoing, sir. We're facing resistance from those unwilling to leave their homes, but most cooperate." As if on cue, a convoy of buses rumbled past, windows clouded with condensation from the frightened passengers within. Petrov watched them go, a mixture of relief and apprehension twisting in his gut. Each evacuee was one less civilian to worry about. However, the sheer number of people still trapped in the city weighed heavily on his conscience. "Lieutenant Volkova," Petrov called out, turning to the young officer who stood nearby, her posture rigid with tension. "What's the situation at the eastern checkpoint?" Anna Volkova stepped forward, her youthful features marred by dark circles under her eyes. "Sir, we're seeing increased activity from the infected. They seem to be drawn to the noise and movement at the checkpoint. We've had to use lethal force more frequently to maintain the perimeter." Petrov's jaw clenched at the news. Each infected individual they were forced to put down had once been a citizen he'd sworn to protect. The moral implications of their actions gnawed at him, but he pushed the thoughts aside. There would be time for reflection later, if they survived. "Double the guard at the eastern checkpoint," he ordered, "and make sure our people are rotating shifts. I need everyone alert and focused." As Volkova hurried off to relay his orders, Petrov turned his attention back to the city sprawled before him. The streets, usually teeming with life, were now littered with abandoned vehicles and debris. In the distance, smoke rose from burning buildings, stark reminders of the chaos that engulfed Moscow in a matter of days. "Major Sokolov," Petrov said, his voice low, "what's your assessment of our current strategy?" Sokolov hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's effective, sir. We're containing the spread and minimizing civilian casualties. But, Petrov prompted, turning to face his second-in-command. "But I fear we're merely delaying the inevitable. The number of infected people is growing, and our resources are stretched thin. We can't maintain this perimeter indefinitely." Petrov nodded grimly. He'd had the same thoughts but had been reluctant to voice them. "We hold the line, Major, for as long as we can. It's all we can do." As the day wore on, the tension in the air grew palpable. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their faces masks of determination tinged with fear. The constant crackle of radio chatter filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of gunfire from the perimeter. Petrov found himself at the western checkpoint, overseeing the deployment of a fresh squad to relieve the exhausted troops who'd been on duty for hours. As he watched the changing of the guard, a commotion near the civilian evacuation point caught his attention. A woman, her clothes torn and dirty, was struggling against two soldiers who were trying to guide her onto a waiting bus. "My husband," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "He's still out there. Please, you have to let me go back." Petrov approached, his presence causing the soldiers to stiffen to attention. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. One of the soldiers spoke up. "Sir, this woman claims her husband is still in the infected zone. We're trying to get her safely, but she's resisting evacuation." Petrov turned to the woman, whose eyes were wild with fear and grief. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I cannot allow you to return to the infected area. It's too dangerous." "You don't understand," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "He's all I have left. Please, you have to help him." The commander felt the weight of her words, each a sharp reminder of the human cost of this crisis. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to say next. "I'm sorry, but our priority is evacuating civilians from the danger zone right now. We have teams searching for survivors, and if your husband is out there, we will do everything in our power to bring him to safety." The woman's shoulders sagged in defeat, and she allowed herself to be led onto the bus without further resistance. Petrov watched her go, the burden of command feeling heavier than ever. As he turned away from the evacuation point, Lieutenant Volkova approached, her face grim. "Sir, we've got a situation at the southern perimeter. A large group of infected has breached the initial barrier. Our forces are engaged, but they're requesting backup." Petrov's mind raced, quickly assessing the strategic implications. "Alert the armored division. I want tanks rolling in 5 minutes. And get me a helicopter. I must see this myself." Within moments, Petrov was airborne, the city sprawling beneath him like a vast, decaying organism. From this vantage point, the accurate scale of the disaster became apparent. Entire neighborhoods had been overrun, the streets teeming with the shambling forms of the infected. Petrov's stomach lurched at the sight below as they approached the southern perimeter. A mass of infected individuals, their movements frenzied and uncoordinated, was pushing against the military blockade. Soldiers fired into the crowd, but 2 more seemed to take the place of every infected that fell. "Take us lower," Petrov ordered the pilot, his eyes fixed on the battle below. The helicopter descended, and Petrov could now make out individual faces among the soldiers. He saw fear, determination, and in some cases a haunting blankness that spoke of the toll this fight was taking on their psyches. Just then the radio crackled to life. "This is Hammer 1, a voice announced, thick with tension. "Armored support is inbound, ETA 2 minutes." Petrov watched as a column of tanks appeared on the horizon, their engines roaring as they sped towards the breach. The sight of the heavy armor seemed to galvanize the beleaguered infantry, who redoubled their efforts to hold the line. The tanks opened fire, their shells tearing through the mass of infected with devastating effects. The tide of the battle began to turn. the combined firepower of the armored division and the infantry slowly pushing the infected back. As the situation stabilized, Petrov ordered the helicopter to return to the command post. His mind was already racing, analyzing the breach and formulating strategies to prevent similar incidents in the future. Petrov convened an emergency meeting with his senior officers back on the ground. Major Sokolov and Lieutenant Volkova stood at attention, their faces etched with the strain of the day's events. "The southern perimeter is secure for now," Petrov began, his voice grave. "But this breach has exposed weaknesses in our defenses. We need to reassess and reinforce our positions immediately." Sokolov nodded in agreement. "Sir, I recommend we divert more heavy armor to support the perimeter. Clearly, infantry alone isn't enough to hold back a determined push by the infected." "Agreed," Petrov said. "Lieutenant Volkova, I want you to coordinate with our engineering units. We must strengthen our physical barriers, concrete blocks, razor wire, anything that can slow down a mass of infected long enough for our forces to respond." Volkova saluted crisply. "Yes, sir. I'll get on it right away." As the meeting concluded and his officers dispersed to carry out their orders, Petrov found himself alone, the weight of command settling heavily on his shoulders. He thought of the woman at the evacuation point, of her missing husband, of all the lives hanging in the balance. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the ravaged city. Petrov stood at the edge of the command post, his eyes scanning the horizon. The distant sound of gunfire and the low rumble of engines filled the air, a constant reminder of the battle they were waging. As darkness fell, the city took on an even more sinister aspect. Fires burned unchecked in the distance, and the eerie moans of the infected carried on the night air. Petrov knew that the coming hours would be crucial. The infected seemed more active at night, and his forces would be tested to their limits. He returned to the bustling command center, steeling himself for the long night ahead. The perimeter had held today, but tomorrow would bring new challenges. As he walked back to his post, Petrov silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect the lives of those still trapped in this nightmare. The infected may have taken much of Moscow, but they would not take it all as long as he drew breath. The eerie silence of Moscow's streets was broken only by the distant echoes of gunfire and the occasional scream. Commander Alexei Petrov stood atop a makeshift observation post, eyes scanning the desolate cityscape. The once bustling metropolis now resembled a war zone, with abandoned vehicles littering the roads and plumes of smoke rising from various districts. "Commander," a voice crackled through his radio. "Recon Team Alpha reporting in. We've reached the designated checkpoint." Petrov pressed the transmit button. "Proceed with caution, Alpha. Report any significant findings immediately." As he lowered the radio, Major Igor Sokolov approached, his face etched with concern. "Sir, our perimeter defenses are holding, but we're detecting increased activity in the southern sector." Petrov nodded grimly. "Dispatch additional units to reinforce that area. We can't afford another breach." As Sokolov hurried off to relay the orders, Petrov's mind wandered to the civilians they had encountered during the evacuation. The desperation in their eyes and the heart-wrenching pleas for help weighed heavily on his conscience. He shook off the thoughts, reminding himself that sentiment had no place in this nightmare. Meanwhile, deep beneath the city streets, Elena Mikhailova huddled with a group of survivors in the dimly lit confines of the Mayakovskaya metro station. The ornate arches and marble columns that once showcased the grandeur of Soviet architecture now served as a sanctuary from the horror above. Elena moved among the survivors, her medical training proving invaluable as she tended to the wounded and sick. Despite her own fear and exhaustion, she maintained a calm demeanor, offering words of comfort to those around her. "Dr. Mikhailova," a young man called out, his voice trembling, "my sister's fever is getting worse. What should we do?" Elena knelt beside the sick woman, her brow furrowed in concentration as she checked her vitals. "We need to keep her hydrated and cool," she instructed, reaching for a damp cloth. "Has anyone been able to find more antibiotics?" The silence that followed was answered enough. Elena sighed, knowing their meager medical supplies were dwindling rapidly. She couldn't help but wonder how long they could survive in this underground refuge before either the infection or starvation claimed them. Above ground, Lieutenant Anna Volkova led her squad through the ruins of a residential complex. The young officer moved with practiced precision, her rifle ready as they cleared each building. "Stay alert," she whispered to her team. "We don't know what we might find." A faint sound caught Anna's attention as they approached a partially collapsed apartment block. She raised her fist, signaling her squad to halt. "Did you hear that?" she asked, straining to listen. Private Yuri Popov nodded. "Sounded like crying?" Anna's heart raced as she considered the implications. Could there still be survivors trapped in the building? Or was it a trick of the wind, or worse, a lure from the infected? "We need to investigate," she decided, her idealism overriding caution. "Popov, Ivanov, with me. The rest of you, secure the perimeter." As they cautiously entered the building, the crying grew louder. Anna led her team up a crumbling staircase, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. On the third floor, they found the source, a young boy, no more than 7 years old, huddled in a corner. Anna approached slowly, holstering her weapon. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're here to help." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear and hope. Anna's heart clenched as she realized the implications of finding a survivor this deep in the infected zone. At the command center, Petrov received unexpected news from Lieutenant Volkova's team. His initial relief at finding survivors quickly gave way to concern. "How many?" he asked, his voice tense. "Just one, sir," Volkova replied. "A young boy. We're bringing him in for medical evaluation now." Petrov exchanged a worried glance with Major Sokolov. "Understood, Lieutenant. Proceed with extreme caution. We'll have a quarantine area prepared." As he ended the transmission, Petrov's mind raced with the potential consequences of this discovery. If there was one survivor, could there be more? And what did this mean for their containment strategy? His thoughts were interrupted by an urgent call from Recon Team Alpha. "Commander, we've detected movement in the Mayakovskaya metro station. It appears to be... Sir, we believe there are civilians down there." Petrov felt the weight of command pressing down on him like never before. The metro, a sprawling network of tunnels and stations, could be a death trap or a sanctuary, and now it potentially held the lives of countless civilians in its depths. "Confirm your findings," he ordered, "but do not engage. I repeat, do not engage until we fully assess the situation." As the recon team acknowledged his orders, Petrov turned to Sokolov. "We need to formulate a plan. If civilians are in the metro, we can't simply leave them there." Sokolov nodded, his expression grave. "Agreed, sir, but extracting them will be extremely dangerous. The tunnels could be crawling with infected." "I'm aware of the risks," Petrov replied, his voice firm, "but we must protect those civilians if we can." As they began to discuss potential strategies, Lieutenant Volkova arrived with the young survivor. The boy, now calmer but still visibly shaken, was immediately taken to the medical tent for evaluation. Volkova approached Petrov, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "Sir, finding that boy, it changes things, doesn't it?" Petrov nodded slowly. "It does, Lieutenant. We can no longer assume that the infected areas are devoid of survivors. We need to reassess our entire approach." As the gravity of the situation settled over them, the command center buzzed with renewed activity. Maps of the metro system were spread out, potential entry points were identified, and risk assessments began. In the medical tent, Dr. Mikhail Kuznetsov examined the young survivor, his experienced hands gentle as he checked for signs of infection. To everyone's relief, the boy showed no symptoms of the mysterious illness that had turned so many into violent, mindless creatures. "He's dehydrated and malnourished," Dr. Kuznetsov reported to Petrov, "but otherwise, he appears to be in good health. Remarkably, he survived this long on his own." Petrov nodded, a glimmer of hope piercing through his professional demeanor. "Thank you, doctor. Please, do everything you can for him." As he left the medical tent, Petrov's radio crackled to life again. It was the recon team, their voices urgent and excited. "Commander, we've made contact with the civilians in the metro. There are dozens of them, maybe more. They've barricaded themselves in the station, but they're running low on supplies. They're requesting immediate assistance." Petrov closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he absorbed this new information. The discovery of these survivors would change everything. It was no longer just about containing the infection. Now, they had a chance to save lives, proving that humanity could triumph even in the darkest times. Opening his eyes, Petrov saw his team looking to him for direction. In that moment, he knew that the decisions he made next would shape not only the fate of those survivors, but potentially the entire course of this crisis. "Assemble the senior officers," he ordered, his voice steady and resolute. "We have a rescue mission to plan." As the command center erupted into a flurry of activity, Petrov allowed himself a moment of reflection. The road ahead would be fraught with danger and difficult choices, but he felt a spark of hope for the first time since the outbreak began. In the depths of Moscow's metro, amidst the chaos and destruction, life was still to be saved. The discovery had been made. Now, the real challenge began. Commander Alexei Petrov stood at the window of the makeshift command center, his eyes fixed on the smoke-filled horizon of Moscow. The city he had sworn to protect was now a battlefield against an enemy he could barely comprehend. The weight of command pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than ever before. A sharp knock on the door broke his reverie. "Enter," he called, turning to face Major Igor Sokolov, who strode into the room with a grim expression etched on his face. "Commander, we've received new orders from High Command," Sokolov announced, his voice tight with tension. Petrov's brow furrowed. "What are they?" Sokolov hesitated, then handed over a sealed envelope. "Sir, they're ordering a complete elimination of all infected zones, including the metro station where we found the civilians." The words hit Petrov like a physical blow. He tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. Each line seemed to confirm his worst fears. The order was clear: no survivors, no exceptions. The infected areas were to be purged, regardless of any potential civilian presence. "This can't be right," Petrov muttered, more to himself than to Sokolov. He looked up at his second-in-command, searching for any sign of disagreement or shock. But Sokolov's face remained impassive, a mask of military discipline. "Sir, the orders are clear," Sokolov said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of unease. "High Command believes it's the only way to contain the outbreak and prevent further spread." Petrov paced the room, his mind racing. The faces of the terrified civilians they had discovered in the metro flashed before his eyes. Men, women, children, all huddled together, clinging to hope in the darkness. And now, with a single order, they were to be sacrificed for the greater good. "Major, what do you think of these orders?" Petrov asked, turning to face Sokolov. Sokolov's composure faltered for a moment. "Sir, it's not my place to question. I'm asking for your opinion, Igor," Petrov interrupted, his tone softening. "We've served together for years. Speak freely." Sokolov took a deep breath. "Honestly, sir, it feels wrong. We're soldiers, not executioners." "But," he trailed off, struggling with his words. "But we have our orders," Petrov finished for him. The age-old dilemma of every soldier, the conflict between duty and conscience. A tense silence filled the room as both men grappled with the implications of their orders. Petrov's mind raced through scenarios, each more dire than the last. If they followed through, they would be condemning innocent civilians to death. If they disobeyed, they would be risking court-martial or worse. Another knock at the door broke the silence. Lieutenant Anna Volkova entered, her young face etched with concern. "Commander, Major, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you need to see." Petrov nodded, grateful for the momentary distraction. "What is it, Lieutenant?" Volkova approached, tablet in hand. "We've been monitoring communications from the metro station. One of the civilians there is a doctor, Elena Mikhailova. She's been sending out encrypted messages detailing the condition of the survivors. And, sir, she claims to have made a breakthrough in understanding the infection." Petrov's eyes widened. He took the tablet, scanning through the decrypted messages. "Doctor, Mikhailova's notes were a mix of medical jargon and desperate pleas for help. Still, one thing was clear: she believed she was close to understanding the outbreak's nature." "This changes everything," Petrov murmured. Sokolov leaned in, reading over Petrov's shoulder. "Sir, our orders are clear, even if she has made a breakthrough. We can't risk." "Can't risk what, Major?" Petrov interrupted, a fire kindling in his eyes. "Can't risk saving lives? Can't risk finding a cure for this nightmare?" "With all due respect, Commander," Sokolov countered, his voice strained, "we can't base our decisions on the unverified claims of a civilian doctor. Our duty is to follow orders and protect the greater population. Petrov set the tablet down, his jaw clenched. Our duty, Major, is to protect all civilians, not just the ones outside the infected zone. The tension in the room was palpable. Lieutenant Volkova shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between her superior officers. "Sir," she ventured, her voice quiet but firm, "I joined the military to protect people. Suppose there's even a chance we can save those civilians and potentially find a solution to this outbreak. Don't we have an obligation to try?" Petrov nodded, a small smile of approval crossing his face. "Well said, Lieutenant." Sokolov's expression hardened. "Commander, I must formally object to any course of action that contradicts our orders. The consequences—" "I'm well aware of the consequences, Major," Petrov cut him off. "But I'm also aware of the consequences of following those orders blindly. We swore an oath to protect our people, not to abandon them at the first sign of danger." The commander turned back to the window, his decision crystallizing in his mind. The smoke on the horizon seemed to clear momentarily, as if the city was holding its breath. "We're going to rescue those civilians," Petrov announced, his voice filled with resolve, "and we're going to bring Dr. Mikhailova and her research out safely." Sokolov's face paled. "Sir, that's in direct violation of our orders. We could be court-martialed, or worse." Petrov turned to face his second-in-command, his eyes blazing with determination. "Then so be it. I'd rather face a court-martial with a clear conscience than live with the knowledge that I condemned innocent people to death." He strode to the center of the room, addressing Sokolov and Volkova. "I won't order either of you to participate in this operation. If you choose to report this to High Command, I won't hold it against you, but I'm going through with this rescue, with or without your help." A heavy silence fell over the room. Volkova was the first to break it. "I'm with you, sir," she said, her voice steady and resolute. All eyes turned to Sokolov. The Major's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, duty, loyalty, and moral uncertainty battling for supremacy. Finally, he straightened his posture and met Petrov's gaze. "I don't agree with this course of action, sir," he said slowly, "but I won't abandon you or the civilians. I'm in." Petrov nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you, both of you. Now let's plan this rescue operation. We'll need to move fast and quietly." As they gathered around the tactical display, Petrov couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line from which there was no return. But as he thought of the terrified faces in the metro, of Dr. Mikhailova's potential breakthrough, he knew in his heart that it was the right decision. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as they meticulously planned the rescue operation. Maps of the metro system were pored over, equipment was gathered, and a small team of trusted soldiers was assembled. As night fell over Moscow, Petrov stood once more at the command center's window. The city glowed an eerie orange, and fires were still burning in various districts. In the distance, he could hear the occasional burst of gunfire, other military units following their orders, perhaps. A soft knock at the door announced Sokolov's presence. "Sir, we're ready to move out." Petrov turned to face his second-in-command. "Igor, I want you to stay and coordinate from the command center. If things go south, I need someone I trust to manage the fallout." Sokolov's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with understanding. "You're giving me an out, aren't you? A chance to claim I was following orders if this goes wrong. Consider it a final order from your commander," Petrov said with a grim smile. "Someone must be here to tell the truth, whatever happens." After a moment of hesitation, Sokolov nodded. "Understood, sir. Good luck." As Petrov made his way to the waiting vehicles, he saw Lieutenant Volkova checking her gear. Her young face was determined, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "Lieutenant," he called out, approaching her, "are you ready for this?" Volkova straightened up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir. I won't let you down." Petrov placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Anna, this mission is about saving lives. No matter what happens, hold on to that." She nodded, her resolve visibly strengthening. "I will, sir." As they climbed into the armored vehicles, Petrov felt a strange calm settle over him. They were about to defy direct orders, risk their lives, and potentially change the course of this crisis. But in his heart, he knew it was the right thing to do. The engines roared to life, and the small convoy began to move out into the darkened streets of Moscow. As they drove towards the metro station and the civilians trapped within, Petrov's mind turned to Dr. Elena Mikhailova. He hoped her breakthrough was real, that this risk would be worth it. But even if it wasn't, he knew he couldn't have lived with himself if he'd abandoned those people. The city loomed around them, dark and foreboding. Somewhere in the shadows, the infected lurked, and beyond that, the weight of military authority pressed down upon them. But for now, all that mattered was the mission ahead, a mission of mercy in a world gone mad. As they approached the perimeter of the infected zone, Petrov steeled himself for what was to come. Orders had been given and lines had been crossed. Now, all that remained was to see it through, whatever the cost. Commander Alexei Petrov stood at the makeshift command center, his eyes fixed on the tactical map of Moscow spread before him. The red zones, indicating areas of heavy infection, seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. His gaze lingered on the metro station where civilians huddled in fear, a beacon of life amidst the chaos. "We can't just leave them there," Petrov muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of communications equipment. Major Igor Sokolov approached, his face etched with concern. "Commander, we've received confirmation of the orders. We're to eliminate all infected zones, including the metro station." Petrov's jaw clenched. The weight of command had never felt heavier. "And the civilians?" Sokolov's eyes darted away, unable to meet Petrov's gaze. "Collateral damage, sir. Those are our orders." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of gunfire and the occasional scream that pierced the air. Petrov's mind raced, replaying the faces of the desperate civilians he'd encountered, the pleas for help that echoed in his dreams. "No," Petrov said finally, his voice firm. "We're going in." Sokolov's eyes widened. "Sir, that's a direct violation of—" "I know what it is, Major," Petrov cut him off, "but I won't have the blood of innocents on my hands, not when we have the power to save them." The next hour was a flurry of activity as Petrov assembled his team. Lieutenant Anna Volkova, her young face of determination and apprehension, stood at attention as Petrov outlined the plan. "This is a high-risk operation," Petrov explained, finger tracing the map's route. "We'll use diversionary tactics to draw the infected away from the metro entrance. Team Alpha will cover fire while Team Bravo moves in for extraction." Volkova nodded, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "And if we encounter resistance from our own forces?" Petrov's eyes met hers, understanding the weight of her question. "We do what's right, Lieutenant. Always." Petrov found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the command center as the teams geared up. He pulled a worn photograph from his breast pocket, a picture of his family, smiling in happier times. His thumb traced the outline of his daughter's face, a reminder of why he fought, why he couldn't stand by and let innocents perish. The journey to the metro station was tense, each soldier acutely aware of the risks they were taking. The streets of Moscow, once bustling with life, now lay in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional moan of the infected or the scuttling of rats among the debris. As they approached the station, Petrov's radio crackled to life. "Sir, we've made contact with the civilians inside. There's a doctor among them, Elena Mikhailova. She's been keeping them alive, but supplies are critically low." Petrov's heart quickened at the news. A doctor could be invaluable in their efforts to save lives. "Understood. We're moving in." The diversionary tactics worked better than expected. A series of controlled explosions drew hordes of infected away from the metro entrance, their shambling forms disappearing into the labyrinth of abandoned streets. Team Bravo, led by Petrov, descended into the metro's darkness. The stench of fear and desperation hit them like a wall as they navigated the tunnels, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They found the survivors huddled in a makeshift camp, their faces gaunt and eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Among them stood Elena Mikhailova, her white coat stained with blood and grime, but her gaze steady as she met Petrov's eyes. "You came," she said simply, her voice hoarse from disuse. Petrov nodded, connecting with this woman who had fought hard to keep hope alive. "We're here to get you out, all of you." As they began the evacuation, gunfire erupted from above. Petrov's radio cracked urgently. "Commander, we've got company. Military units are converging on our position. They know what we're doing." Petrov's mind raced. They were out of time. "Move now." he ordered, helping the weakest civilians to their feet. "We've got to get topside before they seal us in." The ascent to the surface was a nightmare of chaos and confusion. Infected, drawn by the noise, clawed at the edges of their formation. Petrov found himself shoulder to shoulder with Elena, supporting an elderly man between them. "Almost there," Petrov grunted, seeing daylight ahead. As they emerged onto the street, the full scale of their predicament became clear. Military vehicles had formed a perimeter, and soldiers, their comrades, had weapons trained on them. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "Commander Petrov, stand down and surrender the civilians. You are in violation of direct orders." Petrov's mind raced, searching for a way out. He locked eyes with Elena, seeing the same determination mirrored there. At that moment, he knew he couldn't give up or betray the trust these people had placed in him. "Lieutenant Volkova," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Initiate Protocol Omega." Volkova's eyes widened in recognition before she nodded sharply. They had developed a contingency plan, a last resort when all other options were exhausted. In a coordinated move, Petrov's team deployed smoke grenades, obscuring the area in thick, choking clouds. Under cover of the confusion, they began to move the civilians towards prearranged extraction points. Petrov found himself face-to-face with Major Sokolov, who had emerged from the line of opposing forces. They stood in tense silence for a moment, years of friendship and loyalty hanging in the balance. "Igor," Petrov said quietly, "you know this is right." Sokolov's face was a mask of conflict, duty warring with conscience. Finally, he lowered his weapon. "Go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll buy you time." With a nod of gratitude, Petrov led the group away, hearing Sokolov's voice rise above the chaos, coordinating a search in the opposite direction. The next hours were a blur of movement, stealth, and near misses as Petrov's team navigated Moscow's infected zones, guiding the civilians to safety. They used every trick and tactic, from underground passages to improvised distractions. As dawn broke over the city, casting a pale light over the devastation, Petrov stood at the edge of a secure zone, watching as the last of the rescued civilians received medical attention. Elena approached him, exhaustion etched in every line of her face, but a fire of determination still burning in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Petrov sighed, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. "Now we face the consequences, but we saved lives today. That's what matters." As if on cue, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Military police, no doubt, coming to arrest him for his insubordination. Petrov turned to face them, his back straight and his resolve unshaken. He had made his choice, choosing humanity over blind obedience. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he had done what was right. The sun continued to rise over Moscow, and a new day dawned on a city that had forever changed. And in the hearts of those who had lived through the night's terror, a spark of hope burned bright, kindled by the courage of those who had dared to defy the darkness. The sun rose over a scarred Moscow, its warm light starkly contrasting the chaos that engulfed the city. Commander Alexei Petrov stood atop a makeshift command post, his eyes scanning the horizon. The successful rescue operation from the metro station was behind them. Still, the weight of its consequences pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Commander," Major Igor Sokolov's voice broke through Petrov's thoughts. "The last of the civilians have been processed and moved to the secure zone." Petrov nodded, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. "And Dr. Mikhailova?" "She's been taken to our medical facility. Her research is being analyzed as we speak." A flicker of hope ignited in Petrov's chest. Elena Mikhailova's potential breakthrough could be the key to understanding and possibly containing the infection. But at what cost had they secured this hope? As if reading his thoughts, Sokolov added, "Sir, there's something else. High Command demands an immediate report on our deviation from orders." Petrov's jaw clenched. He knew this moment would come, but facing it was another matter. "Prepare the team for debriefing. We'll face this head-on." The command center buzzed with tension as Petrov entered. Officers stood at attention, their faces a mix of pride and apprehension. Lieutenant Anna Volkova caught his eye, her young face etched with worry. "At ease," Petrov commanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "We've all been summoned to explain our actions. Before we do, I want to clarify one thing. Every decision was mine alone. The responsibility is mine to bear." A murmur rippled through the room. Sokolov stepped forward, and his loyalty was evident in every movement. "Sir, with all due respect, we all played a part in this. We stand with you." Petrov felt a swell of pride for his team, even as he prepared to shield them from the fallout. The video conference screen flickered to life, revealing the stern faces of the military high command. "Commander Petrov," General Volkov's voice crackled through the speakers, "explain your blatant disregard for direct orders." Taking a deep breath, Petrov began his report. He detailed the discovery of civilians in the metro, the potential breakthrough in Dr. Mikhailova's research, and the decision to prioritize human lives over strict adherence to protocol. As he spoke, the faces on the screen remained impassive, but Petrov could sense the growing tension. When he finished, silence hung heavy in the air. General Volkov broke it with a cold fury. "You risked the entire containment operation for a handful of civilians and unproven research? Your actions could have jeopardized the safety of the entire country." Petrov stood his ground. "With respect, sir, our duty is to protect all citizens, not just those deemed safe by arbitrary boundaries. Dr. Mikhailova's research could be crucial in understanding and combating this infection." The debate raged on, with voices raised and accusations flying. Petrov maintained his composure, defending his team's actions with unwavering conviction. As the call ended, the weight of uncertainty settled over the room. Petrov turned to his team, their faces a mix of concern and determination. "Prepare for a full after-action review. We need to analyze every aspect of the operation." The next few days were a blur of debriefings, reports, and tense meetings. The media had caught wind of the rescue operation, and public opinion was divided. Some hailed Petrov and his team as heroes, while others condemned them for potentially compromising the city's safety. Amidst the chaos, Petrov found a moment of respite in the medical facility where Elena Mikhailova worked tirelessly. As he entered her makeshift lab, she looked up, her eyes bright with excitement despite the dark circles beneath them. "Commander," she greeted him, a smile breaking through her fatigue. "I think we're onto something. The infection, it's not like anything we've seen before." Petrov listened intently as Elena explained her findings, hope blooming in his chest. Her research could be the key to turning the tide against the infected, justifying the risks they had taken. As he left the lab, Petrov was confronted by Lieutenant Volkova. The young officer's face was a storm of emotions. "Sir, I need to know, was it worth it, all of this?" Petrov placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and firm. "Anna, in this job, we often face impossible choices. But if we lose sight of our humanity and the people we're sworn to protect, then what are we fighting for?" Volkova nodded, her posture straightening with renewed resolve. "Thank you, sir. I understand." The days that followed were filled with intense scrutiny. The after-action review dissected every decision and every movement of the rescue operation. Petrov and his team faced grueling questioning, and their actions were put under a microscope. Major Sokolov stood by Petrov throughout, and his unwavering support was a testament to their years of service together. "We did the right thing, Alexei," he said during a rare quiet moment. "Whatever comes next, we face this crisis with our humanity intact." As the review neared its conclusion, Petrov was called to a private meeting with General Volkov. The older man's face was grave as Petrov entered the room. "Sit down, Alexei," Volkov said, his tone unreadable. "We've reviewed your actions, and while I cannot condone your disregard for orders, I cannot ignore the potential impact of Dr. Mikhailova's research." Petrov held his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You're being reassigned," Volkov continued. "We're establishing a new task force to combat this infection, combining military strategy with scientific research. We want you to lead it." The news hit Petrov like a physical force. It wasn't a punishment, but a recognition of the need for a new approach. "Sir, I thank you, but my team will remain under your command," Volkov finished. "Your loyalty to them is noted, as is theirs to you. You'll need that bond for what's to come." As Petrov left the meeting, his mind raced with the implications of this new assignment. The challenge ahead was daunting, but he felt a glimmer of real hope for the first time since the outbreak began. Returning to his team, Petrov saw the question in their eyes. With a nod, he gathered them close. "We have a new mission," he began, his voice steady and determined. What we've been through and learned, it's all led to this moment. We will find a way to end this nightmare and save our people and city." The faces around him were transformed, and fear and uncertainty gave way to resolve and purpose. They had faced the infected, defied orders, and confronted the consequences of their actions. Now, they stood on the precipice of a new chapter that would test their skills, bonds, and humanity in ways they could not yet imagine. As the team dispersed to prepare for their new assignment, Petrov caught sight of Moscow through a nearby window. The city bore the scars of the outbreak, but it still stood, resilient and alive. At that moment, he silently renewed his vow to protect it and its people, no matter the cost. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape. But in those shadows, Petrov saw not just darkness, but the promise of a new dawn. With his team by his side and the knowledge gained from their trials, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, guided by their unwavering commitment to duty, honor, and preserving human life. Story number 3, The Outbreak Begins. Dublin, Emerald Isle. The first reports trickled in on a crisp autumn day in Dublin just after noon. What began as isolated incidents of violent behavior quickly spiraled into a citywide emergency. By nightfall, the bustling streets of Ireland's capital had transformed into a landscape of chaos and terror. Captain Liam O'Sullivan stood before a wall of screens in the hastily assembled command center, his steely gaze fixed on the unfolding nightmare. At 35, he was a seasoned veteran, his time as an Army Ranger etched into the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders. But nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for this. "Sir, we've lost contact with the unit in Rathmines," a young communications officer reported, her voice trembling slightly. Liam's jaw tightened. "Keep trying. We need eyes on the ground there." As he turned away from the screens, he caught sight of Dr. Maeve Murphy striding purposefully across the room. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen her fair share of emergencies, but her usual composure seemed strained. "Captain," she said, her tone clipped and professional, "we need to talk about the medical situation." Liam nodded, leading her to a quieter corner of the room. "What's the latest, doctor?" Maeve's green eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and determination. "It's worse than we thought. This isn't just a virus, it's rewiring people's brains. The infected are becoming increasingly violent, and the rate of spread is—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Unprecedented." "Any progress on a cure?" Liam asked, already knowing the answer. Maeve shook her head. "We're working around the clock, but this thing, it's like nothing we've ever seen before." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. Sergeant Niall Hayes burst through the door, his uniform splattered with blood, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. "Captain," he called out, his voice carrying across the room, "you need to see this." Liam and Maeve exchanged a glance before following the young sergeant outside. The scene that greeted them was one of utter pandemonium. The streets of Dublin, usually alive with the sounds of traffic and laughter, now echoed with screams and the distant wail of sirens. In the sky above, military helicopters circled, their searchlights cutting through the gathering darkness. On the ground, civilians ran in panic, some carrying children or helping injured friends. And in their midst, moving with an unnatural jerky gait, were the infected. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Liam muttered, his usual stoicism cracking momentarily. Maeve's hand went to her mouth, her medical training warring with the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. "We need to get those people to safety," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Niall, still catching his breath, nodded vigorously. "That's not all, sir. The Gardaí are overwhelmed. They're requesting immediate military support in multiple sectors." Liam's mind raced, years of tactical training kicking into overdrive. "Niall, get back to your unit. I want reconnaissance teams deployed to each city quadrant within the hour. We need to know what we're dealing with." As Niall saluted and hurried off, Liam turned to Maeve. "Doctor, I need you to coordinate with the hospitals, set up triage centers, but make sure they're secure. We can't risk the infection spreading further." Maeve nodded, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Understood, Captain. What about the uninfected civilians?" Liam's eyes scanned the chaos before them. "We'll establish safe zones, shopping centers, schools, and anywhere with sturdy defenses. But our primary objective has to be containment. As they turned to head back inside, a heart-wrenching scream cut through the air. A young woman, her clothes torn and bloodied, was desperately trying to fend off an infected man. Without hesitation, Liam sprinted towards them, drawing his sidearm. "Get down!" he shouted to the woman. As she dropped to the ground, Liam fired 2 precise shots. The infected man stumbled, then fell, motionless. Maeve was at the woman's side instantly, checking for injuries. "Are you all right? Were you bitten?" The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I don't think so. That was my neighbor. He just attacked me out of nowhere." Liam helped the woman to her feet, his voice softening slightly. "You're safe now. We'll get you to a secure location." Liam's radio crackled to life as they escorted the shaken woman back to the command center. "Captain O'Sullivan, this is command. The Taoiseach has declared a state of emergency. The entire Irish Defence Forces are being mobilized." Liam exchanged a grim look with Maeve. "Copy that, command. We're already engaged, requesting permission to implement full containment protocols." There was a pause, heavy with the weight of what that request meant. Finally, the response came. "Permission granted, Captain. May God help us all." Inside the command center, the atmosphere had shifted from tense anticipation to grim determination. Liam strode to the center of the room, his voice cutting through the noise. "Listen up. We are implementing full containment protocols. Our primary objective is to stop the spread of this infection at all costs. Sergeant Hayes, I want your team to coordinate with local law enforcement and set up checkpoints at all major intersections." Niall, who had just returned, nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." Liam continued, his voice growing more authoritative with each word. "Dr. Murphy, work with the medical teams to establish a quarantine protocol. Anyone showing symptoms is to be isolated immediately." Maeve, already pulling up data on her tablet, looked up. "What about their families, Captain? We can't just separate people without." "We don't have a choice, Doctor," Liam cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "The safety of the many has to come before the comfort of the few." As the room burst into action, Liam turned back to the wall of screens. The images were growing more horrific by the minute. In one feed, he saw a group of infected individuals swarming a public bus. In another, a family barricaded themselves in their home as their neighbors, now turned violent, tried to break down the door. Liam's fists clenched at his sides. This was no longer just a military operation. This was a fight for survival, for the very soul of their nation. And as he watched Dublin descend into chaos, he knew that the decisions he made in the coming hours and days would determine the fate of countless lives. As the night wore on, the accurate scale of the outbreak became apparent. Reports flooded in from across the city, each more dire than the last. The infection spread faster than anticipated, and the line between the safe and the infected was blurring by the minute. In the early morning hours, as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, Liam found himself standing on the roof of the command center. The city he loved, the city he had sworn to protect, lay before him in ruins. Smoke rose from several locations, and the distant sound of gunfire punctuated the eerie silence. Maeve joined him, her face drawn with exhaustion. "We've lost contact with 3 more districts," she said quietly. "The infection rate, it's exponential." Liam nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "We're going to have to adapt. Conventional tactics won't work here." "What are you thinking?" Maeve asked, sensing the wheels turning in his mind. "Guerrilla warfare," Liam replied, his voice low and determined. "Small, mobile units, hit-and-run tactics. We can't fight this thing head-on, but we can outsmart it." As they stood there, watching the sunrise on a Dublin forever changed, the weight of their responsibility settled over them like a shroud. The outbreak had begun, with it, a new chapter in human history. For Captain Liam O'Sullivan, Dr. Maeve Murphy, and the brave men and women of the Irish Defence Forces, the fight for survival had only just begun. The city that had weathered centuries of history now faced its greatest challenge yet. And as the new day dawned, bringing with it fresh horrors and untold difficulties, one thing was sure: Dublin would never be the same again. The streets of Dublin, once bustling with life, now echoed with an eerie silence punctuated by distant screams and occasional gunfire. Captain Liam O'Sullivan stood atop a makeshift observation post, his eyes scanning the horizon through high-powered binoculars. The city he had sworn to protect was now a battleground, and the enemy was unlike any he had faced. "Sergeant Hayes, report," O'Sullivan barked into his radio, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Sir, we've spotted a group of infected moving north along O'Connell Street," came the eager reply from Sergeant Niall Hayes. "They seem drawn to the sound of a car alarm." O'Sullivan nodded, his mind already formulating a strategy. "Good work, Hayes. Keep your eyes on them, but maintain your distance. We can't afford to engage unless absolutely necessary." As he lowered the binoculars, O'Sullivan felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Dr. Maeve Murphy, her medical kit slung over her shoulder, a look of concern etched on her face. "Captain, we need to talk about our approach," she said, calm but insistent. "We can't just focus on containment. There are still civilians out there who need our help." O'Sullivan sighed, running a hand through his short, cropped hair. "I know, Doc, but we have our orders. Containment is the priority until we can handle this outbreak." Dr. Murphy's eyes flashed with determination. "And what about the people trapped in their homes, in shops? We can't just leave them to fend for themselves." Before O'Sullivan could respond, his radio crackled to life. "Captain, this is Corporal Brennan. We've received a distress call from a family trapped in the Jervis Shopping Center. They say they're running low on supplies and the infected are trying to break in." O'Sullivan and Dr. Murphy exchanged a look, the weight of the situation hanging between them. This was precisely the kind of scenario they had been debating. "Understood, Corporal. Stand by for further instructions," O'Sullivan replied, his mind racing through potential courses of action. Dr. Murphy seized the moment. "Captain, this is our chance to make a difference. We can't ignore a direct plea for help." O'Sullivan nodded slowly, his tactical mind already formulating a plan. "You're right, Doc, but we do this smart. We're not just charging in guns blazing." He turned to address the small group of soldiers gathered nearby. "Listen up, people. We're implementing guerrilla tactics. Small teams, quick strikes, minimal engagement with the infected. Our primary goal is to reach and extract civilians while maintaining our own safety." The soldiers nodded, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. O'Sullivan continued, "We'll use the urban terrain to our advantage. Rooftops, alleyways, anything that gives us cover and vantage points. Sergeant Hayes, you'll lead the first team. Dr. Murphy, you're with me." As the soldiers began to gear up, O'Sullivan pulled Hayes aside. "Niall, I need you to be extra cautious out there. This isn't like any operation we've run before. The infected are unpredictable, and we still don't fully understand how this virus spreads." Hayes nodded, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the gravity of the situation. "Understood, sir. We won't let you down." As the teams dispersed, O'Sullivan and Dr. Murphy went through the eerily quiet streets using abandoned vehicles and debris for cover. The once familiar cityscape now felt alien and hostile. "Captain," Dr. Murphy whispered as they crouched behind an overturned bus, "I've been analyzing the data we've gathered on the infected. Their behavior seems to be driven primarily by sound and movement. If we can create distractions, we might be able to draw them away from the shopping center." O'Sullivan nodded, impressed by her quick thinking. "Good idea, Doc. We'll incorporate that into our extraction plan." As they approached the Jervis Shopping Center, the scale of their challenge became apparent. Dozens of infected milled about the entrance, their movements erratic and threatening. Inside, barely visible through the glass doors, huddled figures sought refuge in a barricaded store. O'Sullivan's radio crackled again. "Sir, this is Hayes. We've set up observation posts around the perimeter. It's not looking good. The infected are concentrated heavily at the main entrance." "Copy that, Hayes. Stand by for further instructions," O'Sullivan replied, his mind racing through potential strategies. Dr. Murphy touched his arm, her eyes wide with concern. "Captain, those people in there must be the Murphy family. We have to get them out." O'Sullivan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Agreed, but we do this smart. We can't risk losing any of our own in the process." He keyed his radio again. "All units, this is Captain O'Sullivan. We're initiating Operation Emerald Rescue. Our objective is to extract the civilian family from the Jervis Shopping Center. We'll use distraction tactics to draw the infected away from the main entrances." As the soldiers acknowledged his orders, O'Sullivan turned to Dr. Murphy. "Doc, I need you to stay back and coordinate our medical response. If anyone gets injured during this operation, they'll need your expertise." Dr. Murphy looked like she wanted to argue but nodded reluctantly. "Understood, Captain, but please be careful. We can't afford to lose you." O'Sullivan managed a grim smile. "Don't worry, Doc. I've got no intention of becoming zombie chow today." With a final nod to Dr. Murphy, O'Sullivan moved into position, signaling his team to begin the operation. O'Sullivan led a small team towards the shopping center as the first distractions, a mix of recorded sounds and remote-controlled devices, drew the infected away from the entrance. The next few minutes were a blur of tense movement and suppressed breath as they navigated through the thinning horde of infection. As they reached the entrance, O'Sullivan could see the terror-stricken faces of the Murphy family, Tom, Sarah, and their children Emily and James, peering out from their makeshift barricade. "Irish Defense Forces," O'Sullivan called out in a hushed but authoritative tone. "We're here to get you out. Stay calm and follow our instructions exactly." As the family emerged from their hiding place, the sound of gunfire erupted from the perimeter. O'Sullivan's radio crackled with urgent reports. The distractions were losing effectiveness, and the infected were starting to return. "Move, move, move," O'Sullivan urged, guiding the family towards their escape route. He could see the fear in their eyes, especially the children's, but there was no time for comfort now. Survival was the only priority. As they reached the extraction point, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. O'Sullivan turned to see an infected lunging at Emily, the young girl frozen in terror. He threw himself between them without hesitation, using his rifle as a makeshift barrier. The infected's teeth gnashed inches from his face, its inhuman strength threatening to overwhelm him. For a moment, O'Sullivan felt fear, not for himself, but for the innocent lives depending on him. Then, with a sharp crack, the infected dropped to the ground. O'Sullivan looked up to see Sergeant Hayes, his rifle still raised, a mix of shock and determination on his face. "Nice shot, Sergeant," O'Sullivan managed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Couldn't let you have all the fun, sir," Hayes replied, a hint of his usual enthusiasm breaking through the tension. As they regrouped with the rest of the team, O'Sullivan could see the toll the operation had taken on his soldiers. They were trained for combat, but this was something else entirely. Back at the command post, as Dr. Murphy tended to the shell-shocked Murphy family, O'Sullivan gathered his team for a debrief. The weight of their actions, the lives saved, and the risks taken hung heavy in the air. "Good work out there, everyone," O'Sullivan began, his voice carrying pride and wariness. "We faced an unprecedented situation today, and you all performed admirably. But this is just the beginning. We've proven that rescue operations are possible, but come with great risk." He paused, looking each of his soldiers in the eye. "The choices we make in the coming days will define not just our mission, but who we are as defenders of this nation. We'll face more difficult decisions and more moments where duty and compassion collide. But remember this, in saving that family today, we've kept a spark of humanity alive in this chaos." As the team dispersed, O'Sullivan stood alone, looking over the city he had sworn to protect. The outbreak had changed everything, blurring the lines between right and wrong, duty and morality. But in the faces of the Murphy family, in the determined eyes of his soldiers, he saw hope. And in that moment, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, holding on to their humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. The sun began to set over Dublin, casting long shadows across the altered landscape. The battle was far from over, but for now they had found a reason to keep fighting in this small victory. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the desolate streets of Dublin as Captain Liam O'Sullivan led his squad towards the Jervis shopping centre. The once bustling retail hub now stood as a silent fortress, its glass facade reflecting the city's eerie emptiness. Inside, the Murphy family awaited rescue, their fate hanging in the balance. Liam's eyes scanned the perimeter, his seasoned instincts on high alert. "Sergeant Hayes, take point. Dr. Murphy, stay close," he ordered, his voice low and authoritative. Niall Hayes nodded, his youthful eagerness tempered by the gravity of their mission. He moved forward, assault rifle at the ready, every step calculated and cautious. Dr. Maeve Murphy followed closely, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Her calm demeanor belied the tension coursing through her veins. "Any sign of movement, Captain?" she whispered. Liam shook his head. "Nothing yet, but stay sharp. They could be anywhere." The squad approached the main entrance, the automatic doors frozen in place, a testament to the abrupt halt of normal life. Liam signaled for a halt, then gestured for 2 soldiers to secure the perimeter. "All right, listen up," Liam addressed the squad, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to do a quick recon. Hayes, you're with me. Dr. Murphy, stay here with Corporal Flynn. The rest of you maintain a defensive perimeter. If any sign of the infection, you radio in immediately. Clear?" A chorus of hushed affirmatives answered him. Liam and Niall moved silently towards the building, their weapons raised. They peered through the grimy windows, searching for movement within the darkened interior. "Sir," Niall whispered, pointing towards a flickering light on the 2nd floor. "Could be the Murphy family." Liam nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Good eye, Hayes. Let's head back and brief the team." As they rejoined the squad, Liam quickly established communication with higher command. "Echo 1 to base, we've located a potential position for the targets, requesting permission to proceed with extraction." The radio crackled to life. "Echo 1, this is base. Permission granted. Please be advised that we've detected increased infected activity in your sector. Proceed with extreme caution." Liam's jaw tightened. "Understood, base. Echo 1 out." He turned to his team, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "All right, here's the plan. We're going to use a 2-pronged approach. Team Alpha, led by Dr. Murphy and me, will enter through the main entrance and make our way to the 2nd floor. Team Bravo, led by Sergeant Hayes, will create a diversion on the opposite side of the building to draw any infected away from our position." Maeve stepped forward, her face etched with concern. "Captain, what about potential civilians? We can't risk harming innocent people." Liam nodded, acknowledging her point. "Good call, Doctor. We'll use non-lethal tactics where possible. Flashbangs and smoke grenades to disorient and confuse. Lethal force is authorized only as a last resort." The squad murmured their agreement, the weight of their responsibility settling heavily on their shoulders. "Hayes," Liam continued, "your team will set up a series of controlled explosions using the C4 we brought. Nothing too big, just enough to create noise and draw attention. Once we've secured the family, we'll signal for extraction. Any questions?" The squad remained silent, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. "All right then," Liam said, checking his watch. "We move in 5. Get ready." As the soldiers prepared their gear, Liam pulled Maeve aside. "Doctor, I need you to be prepared for anything. We don't know what condition the family will be in." Maeve nodded, her professional demeanor masking her inner turmoil. "I'm ready, Captain. We'll get them out." The 5 minutes passed in tense silence. Liam raised his fist, signaling the start of the operation. Team Bravo moved out, disappearing around the corner of the building. Liam led Team Alpha towards the main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the empty plaza. As they reached the doors, a series of muffled explosions erupted from the far side of the mall. "That's our cue," Liam whispered. "Move in." The team entered the darkened mall, their night vision goggles revealing a scene of chaos and destruction. Overturned kiosks and scattered debris littered the floor, creating an obstacle course of potential dangers. They moved swiftly but cautiously, their training kicking in as they cleared each area. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant sounds of the diversion and the occasional groan of the building settling. As they approached the escalators leading to the 2nd floor, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the mall. Liam held up his fist, halting the team. "That came from above," Maeve whispered, her voice tight with concern. Liam nodded. "Double time! Move!" They ascended the motionless escalator, weapons at the ready. As they reached the 2nd floor, the flickering light they had spotted earlier became visible, emanating from a small cafe. Approaching the cafe, they could hear muffled sobs coming from inside. Liam signaled for the team to take positions around the entrance. "Irish Defense Forces," he called out, his voice firm but reassuring. "We're here to help. Is anyone there?" A moment of silence followed, then a trembling voice responded. "Help us, please. We're trapped." Liam exhaled in relief. Mr. Murphy, we're coming in. Stay calm. The team entered the cafe, scanning for threats before focusing on the huddled family in the corner. Tom Murphy stood protectively in front of his wife and children, his face a mixture of fear and hope. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice breaking. We thought no one was coming." Maeve rushed forward, her medical training taking over. "Is anyone injured?" she asked, already beginning to assess the family. Sarah Murphy shook her head. "Just scared and hungry. We've been here for days." As Maeve tended to the family, Liam's radio crackled to life. "Captain, this is Hayes. The infected are starting to lose interest in our diversion. We need to move fast." "Copy that, Sergeant," Liam replied. "We've secured the family. Begin to fall back to the extraction point." Turning to the Murphys, Liam's voice took on a gentle but urgent tone. "We need to move now. Stay close to us and do exactly as we say." "Understood?" The family nodded, fear and relief warring in their eyes. As they prepared to move out, a crash echoed from the floor below, followed by the unmistakable sounds of infected individuals. "Change of plans," Liam said, his mind racing. "We're going up. There's a maintenance stairwell that leads to the roof. We'll call for air extraction from there." The team moved swiftly, guiding the Murphy family through the darkened mall. The sounds of the infected grew louder, spurring them on. As they reached the stairwell, Liam's radio crackled again. "Captain, this is base. We've got a chopper en route to your position. ETA 5 minutes. "Copy that, base," Liam replied. "We're heading to the roof now." They ascended the stairs, the family's labored breathing mixing with the distant groans of the infected. As they burst onto the roof, the cool morning air hit them, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the mall. Liam quickly organized the team into a defensive position, with the Murphy family huddled in the center. The distant sound of rotor blades grew steadily louder. As the helicopter appeared on the horizon, a crash from the stairwell door sent everyone's hearts racing. The infected had found them. "Hold the line," Liam shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Protect the family at all costs." The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouted orders as the team fought to keep the infected at bay. The helicopter descended, its downdraft creating a maelstrom on the rooftop. "Go, go, go!" Liam yelled, urging the Murphy family towards the waiting chopper. Maeve helped them aboard, her face set in grim determination. As the last team boarded, Liam took a final look at the city below. Dublin, his home, is now a battleground. With a heavy heart, he climbed aboard, the helicopter lifting off just as the infected burst onto the roof. As they soared away from the mall, the adrenaline of the rescue began to fade, replaced by a mix of relief and somber reflection. The Murphy family huddled together, tears of joy and fear mingling on their faces. Liam caught Maeve's eye, a silent understanding passing between them. They had succeeded in their mission, but at what cost? And what challenges lay ahead in this new, terrifying world? As the helicopter banked towards the safe zone, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the city. It was a new day in Dublin, but whether it would bring hope or further despair remained. The flickering fluorescent lights of the makeshift command center cast an eerie glow over Captain Liam O'Sullivan and his team's faces. The air was tense as they huddled around a worn map of Dublin, the once familiar streets now a battleground against an invisible enemy. "We can't just leave them there," Dr. Maeve Murphy insisted, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She pointed to the red circle marking the Jervis Shopping Center on the map. "The Murphy family? They're running out of time." Captain O'Sullivan's jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, each soldier silently awaiting his decision. The rescue mission they had planned was risky, teetering on the edge of insubordination. "I understand your concern, Dr. Murphy," he began, his tone measured, "but we have our orders. Containment is the priority. We can't risk compromising the entire operation for one family." Sergeant Niall Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his youthful features etched with conflict. "Sir, with all due respect, isn't protecting civilians exactly what we signed up for?" O'Sullivan's radio crackled to life, interrupting the tense exchange. "Captain O'Sullivan, this is Colonel Brennan. Status report." Liam glanced at Maeve before responding. "Sir, we're finalizing our strategy for securing the perimeter around Sector 7. There are no significant changes to report." There was a pause on the other end. Very well, Captain. Remember, our primary objective is containment. We cannot afford to let this infection spread further. Brennan out. As the radio fell silent, the weight of the unspoken rescue plan hung heavy in the air. O'Sullivan turned back to his team, his expression grave. You all heard the Colonel. Our orders are clear. Dr. Murphy stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. Liam, we took an oath to protect and serve. Those people in the mall, they're counting on us. If we turn our backs on them now, what does that say about who we are? The captain's stoic facade cracked slightly, revealing the internal struggle beneath. Maeve, I hear you, but we have to consider the bigger picture. We risk exposing more civilians to the infection if we breach containment protocols. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Sergeant Hayes interjected, his voice tinged with frustration. But sir, if we start thinking like that, where do we draw the line? Today it's the Murphy family. Tomorrow it could be hundreds more. We can't just write them off as acceptable losses. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the gravity of their situation settled over them. O'Sullivan paced the length of the command center, the weight of command bearing down on his shoulders. All right, he said finally, turning to face his team. Let's break this down. Dr. Murphy, what's your assessment of the risks involved in a rescue operation? Maeve straightened, her professional demeanor taking over. The primary risk is exposure to the infected. We'd need to move quickly and quietly to minimize contact. There's also the possibility of structural hazards within the mall itself. But with proper precautions and a well-executed plan, I believe we can mitigate these risks. O'Sullivan nodded, then turned to Sergeant Hayes. Niall, how would you approach this from a tactical standpoint? Hayes leaned over the map, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by the seriousness of the situation. We could use a small team, sir. No more than 4 or 5 of us. We'd need to create a diversion to draw the infected away from our entry point. Once inside, we'd move tightly, sweeping each area before advancing. As the discussion continued, the radio crackled once more. All units, be advised. We have reports of increased infected activity in Sector 8. Reinforcements are being dispatched. The news sent a ripple of unease through the room. Sector 8 was dangerously close to the shopping center where the Murphy family was trapped. O'Sullivan's expression hardened. Time is not on our side. If we're going to do this, we need to move now. Dr. Murphy stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. Liam, I know you're torn, but sometimes doing the right thing means making a hard choice. Those people need us. The captain met her gaze, seeing the reflection of his internal struggle in her eyes. He took a deep breath, then turned to address the room. Listen up, everyone. What I'm about to say doesn't leave this room. He paused, making eye contact with each member of his team. We're going to execute Operation Emerald Rescue. But let me be clear, this is not an official mission. Anyone who participates voluntarily understands the risks and potential consequences. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered soldiers. Sergeant Hayes stood a little straighter, a mix of relief and determination on his face. Sir, I'm in, he said without hesitation. Dr. Murphy nodded, a small smile of gratitude on her lips. Count me in as well. The other soldiers voiced their support one by one. O'Sullivan felt a swell of pride in his team, even as the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. All right then, we move out in 30 minutes, gear up and prepare for close-quarters combat. Remember, our primary objective is to extract the Murphy family with minimal engagement. We get in and out, and we do it quietly. As the team dispersed to prepare, O'Sullivan pulled Dr. Murphy aside. Maeve, I need you to be absolutely certain about this. If anything goes wrong, she cut him off, her voice firm. I am certain, Liam. This is why we're here, to make a difference when it matters most. He nodded, a mix of admiration and concern in his eyes. All right, but you stay close to me in there. No heroics. As they geared up, the tension in the air was palpable. Each soldier checked and double-checked their equipment, the gravity of their unsanctioned mission weighing heavily on their minds. Sergeant Hayes approached O'Sullivan, his voice low. Sir, what if we run into other civilians in there? Do we extract them too? The captain paused, the ethical dilemma hitting him anew. We focus on the Murphy family, but if we can safely extract others without compromising the mission, we do it. Use your judgment, Niall. Just remember, every person we bring out increases our risk of detection." Hayes nodded, understanding the impossible balance they were trying to strike. As the team gathered for a final briefing, O'Sullivan looked at their faces. Determined, scared, resolute. He felt the weight of their trust, the burden of the lives they were about to risk, both their own and those they hoped to save. "Remember," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil, "we're not just soldiers today. We're the last hope for those people trapped in there. Whatever happens, we stick together. We're family now, just like the Murphys, and family looks out for each other." With a final nod, Captain O'Sullivan led his team out into the infected streets of Dublin. As they moved silently through the shadows, each step bringing them closer to the Jervis shopping center, the ethical dilemma that had sparked such heated debate faded into the background. Now, there was only the mission and the hope they were making the right choice. The city around them was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant scream or the sound of breaking glass. As they approached the mall, the true scale of their task became apparent. Infected individuals shambled aimlessly in the streets, their movements erratic and unpredictable. O'Sullivan held up a closed fist, signaling the team to halt. He turned to Dr. Murphy, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last chance to back out, Maeve. Once we're in there, there's no turning back." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "We're doing the right thing, Liam. I'm with you all the way." With a nod, O'Sullivan signaled to advance. As they moved towards the mall's entrance, the weight of their decision pressed down upon them. They were no longer just following orders, they were following their conscience. And in a world turned upside down by infection and chaos, that moral compass might be the only thing keeping them human. The fluorescent lights of the Jervis shopping center flickered ominously as Captain Liam O'Sullivan led his squad through the eerily quiet corridors. The once bustling mall now stood as a testament to the chaos that had engulfed Dublin, its abandoned shops and overturned kiosks creating a maze of potential dangers. "Stay alert," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their boots on the polished floor. "We don't know how many infected are in here." Dr. Maeve Murphy, her medical kit slung over her shoulder, moved silently beside him. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, ready to spot any sign of movement. Sergeant Niall Hayes brought up the rear, his weapon raised and his young face set in grim determination. As they approached the central atrium, a distant crash echoed through the building, followed by an inhuman shriek that sent chills down their spines. Liam held up a closed fist, signaling the squad to halt. "Second floor, north side," he murmured into his radio. "Team 2, can you confirm?" "Affirmative, Captain," came the crackling response. "We've got movement up here. Looks like a group of infected, maybe 5 or 6. Liam's mind raced, weighing their options. The Murphy family reportedly hid in a storage room near the food court. However, getting there without attracting attention was challenging. "All right, listen up," he said, turning to his team. "We're going to use the service corridors to flank around. Team 2 will create a diversion to draw the infected away from our position. Dr. Murphy, stay close. Hayes, you're on rear guard." As they moved into position, Maeve touched Liam's arm. "Captain, what if the family is injured? We might need to stabilize them before extraction." Liam nodded grimly. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's focus on getting to them alive." The squad slipped into the narrow service corridor, the darkness enveloping them like a shroud. The distant sounds of the infected grew louder, punctuated by the occasional crash of something being overturned or smashed. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, followed by the rapid staccato of gunfire. Team 2 had sprung into action, drawing the infected from the squad's position. "Move now!" Liam ordered, and they burst from the corridor into the food court. The scene before them was one of utter devastation. Overturned tables and chairs littered the area, and the unmistakable stench of decay hung heavy in the air. Roar. As they swept the area, a muffled sob caught their attention. "Hello?" Liam called out cautiously. "Murphy family? This is the Irish Defence Forces. We're here to help." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, a trembling voice responded from behind a barricaded kiosk. "Here! We're here!" Maeve rushed forward, her medical instincts taking over. "Are you injured? Is anyone hurt?" As Liam and Hayes secured the perimeter, Maeve helped the family emerge from their hiding place. His face was haggard and streaked with dirt, and Tom Murphy supported his wife Sarah, who limped heavily. Their children, Emily and James, clung to their parents, wide-eyed with fear. "Sarah's ankle," Tom explained hurriedly. "She twisted it when we were running." Maeve knelt to examine the injury, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "It's a bad sprain, but not broken. I can stabilize it for now, but we must move quickly." As Maeve worked, Liam's radio crackled to life. "Captain, we've got a problem," came the urgent voice of Team 2's leader. "The infected are more numerous than we thought. We're pinned down on the second floor. We need backup now." Liam clenched his jaw as he considered his options. They couldn't leave Team 2 to fend for themselves, but evacuating the Murphy family was their primary objective. "Hayes," he barked, "take point. Get the family to the extraction point on the roof. Dr. Murphy, go with them. I'll assist Team 2 and meet you there." Niall's eyes widened. "But sir—" "That's an order, Sergeant," Liam cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "Get them out safely. That's your mission now." As Hayes began to usher the family towards the emergency stairwell, Liam turned to Maeve. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. "Be careful," she said softly. Liam nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Always am, Doc. Now go, get them to safety." As Maeve hurried after Hayes and the Murphy family, Liam sprinted towards the escalators, his weapon ready. The sounds of combat grew louder as he ascended, the growls of the infected mixing with the shouts of his men. Emerging onto the second floor, Liam was met with a scene of chaos. Team 2 had barricaded themselves behind an overturned kiosk, firing desperately at a surging mass of infected that threatened to overwhelm them. "Cover me!" Liam shouted, charging forward. He fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The infected nearest him crumpled, creating a momentary gap in their ranks. Seizing the opportunity, Liam vaulted over the barricade, landing beside the beleaguered soldiers of Team 2. "Status report," he demanded, reloading his weapon. "3 wounded, sir," the team leader gasped, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Ammo's running low. We can't hold them off much longer." Liam's mind raced, assessing their options. They were outnumbered and outflanked and out with no clear path of retreat. But giving up wasn't an option, not when Hayes and Maeve were counting on them to buy time for the Murphy family's evacuation. "Listen up," Liam said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're going to create a bottleneck. Use the shop fronts to funnel them into a kill zone. Conserve your ammo, and make every shot count. We hold this position until we get the all clear from the extraction team. Understood?" A chorus of affirmatives rang out, the soldiers' resolve strengthened by their captain's unwavering leadership. As they repositioned, using mannequins and clothing racks to create a makeshift funnel, Liam allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They might be outnumbered, but they weren't beaten yet. The infected came in waves, their inhuman shrieks echoing off the mall's high ceilings. Liam and his men held their ground, their disciplined fire cutting down the attackers ruthlessly. But for every infected that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. As the battle raged on, Liam's radio crackled to life. "Captain, this is Hayes. We've reached the roof. The chopper's inbound. ETA 3 minutes. Relief flooded through Liam, but he kept his voice steady as he replied. "Copy that, Sergeant. Good work. We'll hold them off down here. Get that family to safety." No sooner had he spoken than a deafening roar filled the air. As if sensing their prey was about to escape, the infected surged forward with renewed fury. The barricade began to buckle under the onslaught. "Fall back!" Liam shouted, firing continuously as he covered his men's retreat. "To the escalators! Move!" They fought their way back, step by bloody step, the infected hot on their heels. As they reached the top of the escalators, Liam saw their salvation. A heavy security gate, designed to seal off sections of the mall. "Get that gate down," he ordered, taking up a defensive position. 2 soldiers rushed to comply, struggling with the manual release mechanism. The gate began to lower, agonizingly slowly. The infected were mere meters away now, their grasping hands reaching for the retreating soldiers. Liam's weapon clicked empty, and he drew his sidearm, determined to make his last bullets count. Just as the first infected reached them, the gate slammed shut with a resounding clang. The creatures fought against it, howling in frustration, but the reinforced metal held firm. Liam let himself catch his breath. the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his system. "Everyone all right?" he asked, looking over his battered team. Before anyone could answer, the distinctive thrum of helicopter blades filled the air. Liam's radio crackled once more. "Captain, this is Hayes. The Murphy family is secure. We're lifting off now. What's your status?" Liam looked at his men, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, but alive. He thought of the family they'd saved and of the mission they'd accomplished against impossible odds. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he replied, "Mission accomplished, Sergeant. We're coming home." As they went to the roof for extraction, Liam's thoughts turned to the challenges ahead. The battle for Dublin was far from over, and the ethical dilemmas they'd faced today were just the beginning. But for now, they had won a small victory. A family saved, a team intact, and a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had engulfed their city. The rescue operation was over, but the war against the infected had just begun. Captain Liam O'Sullivan knew that whatever came next, he and his team would face it together, guided by their duty, training, and unwavering commitment to protecting the people of Ireland. The helicopter's blades whirred to a stop as Captain Liam O'Sullivan and his team touched down at the makeshift military base on the outskirts of Dublin. The adrenaline that had fueled them through the rescue mission at Jervis Shopping Centre was beginning to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep wariness that seemed to seep into every fiber of their beings. As they disembarked, Liam caught sight of Dr. Maeve Murphy helping the Murphy family, Tom, Sarah, Emily, and James, onto solid ground. The family's eyes were wide with a mix of relief and lingering fear, and their bodies huddled close together as if afraid they might be separated again at any moment. "Get them to medical for a full checkup," Liam ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting over the chaos of the past few hours. Maeve nodded, gently guiding the family towards a nearby tent adorned with a red cross. Sergeant Niall Hayes approached, his young face etched with fatigue and something deeper, a haunted look that Liam recognized all too well. "Sir, what now?" Niall asked, his usual enthusiasm dampened by the weight of their recent experiences. Liam placed a hand on the young sergeant's shoulder. "Now, we debrief. Then we rest. We've all earned it." The squad approached the command center, a large tent buzzing with activity. Maps of Dublin covered the walls, and red markers indicated infected zones that seemed to grow with each passing hour. Colonel Brennan, a stern-faced man with graying hair at his temples, stood at the center, his eyes narrowing as Liam's team entered. "Captain O'Sullivan," Brennan's voice cut through the din, "I believe you have some explaining to do." Liam straightened his spine, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. "Sir, I take full responsibility for the decision to rescue the Murphy family. It was a direct violation of containment protocols," Brennan interrupted, his voice sharp. "You risked the lives of your entire squad, not to mention potentially compromising our defensive perimeter." The tent fell silent, all eyes on the exchange between the colonel and the captain. Liam could feel the tension radiating from his team behind him. "With all due respect, sir," Liam began, his tone measured but firm, "we swore an oath to protect the people of Ireland. That family was in imminent danger and we had the means to save them. I stand by my decision." Colonel Brennan's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Dr. Murphy stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may," she interjected, her calm voice contrasting the charged atmosphere. "The successful rescue of the Murphy family provides invaluable data on civilian survival in infected zones. Their experiences could be crucial in developing more effective containment and rescue strategies." The colonel's expression softened slightly as he considered Maeve's words. After a moment, he nodded. "Very well. I want a full report on my desk by 600 tomorrow. For now, get your team some rest, Captain. We'll discuss the implications of your actions in detail later." As the team filed out of the command center, Liam could feel the weight of their ordeal settling over them like a heavy blanket. They went to the barracks silently, each lost in their thoughts. Inside the sparse sleeping quarters, Niall finally broke the silence. "Do you think we did the right thing, sir?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam sat heavily on his cot, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I don't know if there's a clear right or wrong anymore, Niall, but I do know that we saved lives today. That has to count for something." Maeve, who had been checking on the few minor injuries sustained during the mission, joined the conversation. "It's not just about the lives we save directly," she added, her eyes filled with exhaustion and determination. "It's about what those lives represent. Hope, humanity, the things we're fighting to preserve." The team nodded in agreement, the weight of their choices and actions hanging heavily in the air. As they settled into their cots, Liam stared at the canvas ceiling, his mind replaying the day's events. The following day came too soon, the harsh light of dawn filtering through the tent flaps. Liam rose early, going to the command center to deliver his report as ordered. As he walked, he noticed the base coming to life around him, soldiers going about their duties, medical staff preparing for another day of uncertainty. Colonel Brennan was already waiting inside the command center, with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. "Captain," he greeted, his tone noticeably less hostile than the previous evening. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports. Take a seat." Liam sat across from the colonel, bracing himself for whatever was to come. "Your actions yesterday were reckless," Brennan began, his eyes fixed on Liam. "But they were also brave, and as Dr. Murphy pointed out, potentially valuable to our overall strategy." Liam felt a glimmer of hope. "Sir? We've been so focused on containment that we've lost sight of the human element," Brennan continued. "Your mission, while unauthorized, has forced us to reevaluate our approach. We can't save everyone, but we can't abandon our humanity either." The colonel stood, pacing behind his desk. "I'm establishing a new task force, Captain. Its mission will be to develop and implement rescue protocols within our containment strategy. I want you to lead it." Liam felt a surge of pride and determination. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Liam's mind was already racing with possibilities as he left the command center. He found his team gathered near the mess tent, their faces lighting up as he approached. "What's the word, Captain?" Niall asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Liam allowed himself a small smile. "We've got work to do," he said, gesturing for them to follow him. "It's time to redefine what it means to protect and serve in this new world." As they walked, Liam caught sight of the Murphy family in the distance, being escorted to a more permanent shelter within the base. Tom Murphy's eyes met Liam's, and the man nodded in silent gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it reinforced the importance of their mission. The team gathered around a makeshift planning table, and maps and reports were spread out before them. Liam looked at each of their faces, Maeve's quiet determination, Niall's youthful eagerness, and the seasoned resolve of the other squad members. "Yesterday we took a risk," Liam began, his voice steady and clear. "We chose to prioritize lives over protocol. It wasn't an easy decision, and it won't always be right, but it reminded us of why we're here, not just to contain a threat, but to preserve what makes us human." He pointed to the map of Dublin, its familiar streets now marked with danger zones and potential safe havens. "Our job now is to find a balance. We need to develop strategies that allow us to rescue civilians without compromising our overall containment efforts. It won't be easy, but I believe it's necessary." Maeve leaned forward, her medical expertise already formulating ideas. "We'll need to establish clear criteria for rescue operations," she said. "Risk assessment protocols, extraction methods tailored to different scenarios." Niall chimed in, his earlier doubts replaced by determination. "We could create specialized rescue teams, sir. Small, mobile units trained specifically for high-risk extractions." Liam nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing in the chaos of the outbreak. "Exactly. We'll work closely with intelligence to identify high-priority rescue targets. But more than that, we need to remember that every life we save is a victory against this, whatever this is that's trying to destroy us." As the team delved into planning, Liam felt renewed hope. They had faced the darkness, made impossible choices, and emerged with their humanity intact. It wasn't just about containment anymore. It was about reclaiming their world, one rescue at a time. The day wore on, filled with intense discussions, strategic planning, and the constant backdrop of a city in crisis. But as the sun began to set over Dublin, casting long shadows across the military base, Liam looked at his team. He saw not just soldiers, but guardians of hope in a world gone mad. They had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and heartbreaking decisions. But they would face it together, armed not just with weapons and tactics, but with the unshakable belief that in saving others, they were saving themselves, and the essence of what it meant to be human in the face of unimaginable horror.